Good morning, everybody. Happy Mardi Gras, and welcome back to WIDA's 2024 Washington International Trade Conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's program, and we're pleased you can be with us again today. Either those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are online, welcome. For those of you on Zoom, a reminder that your Zoom link for today will work all day, so if you have to log off and log back on, the same link you used to get on just now will work for the rest of the day. For those of you who are here in the Reagan Building, welcome. We're delighted you could join us. We have a terrific buffet lunch later in the program. Special thanks to our sponsors for their support for this year's conference, our benefactors, Amazon, UPS, Trade Data Monitor, and the National Pork Producers Council, our executive sponsor, Business Roundtable, and our patrons, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, National Retail Federation, Aluminum Association, Express Association of America, and Trade Center Management Associates and the International Trade Center, our hosts at this lovely venue. We have a diverse set of speakers today and hope to cover a lot of ground. To introduce our first speaker, I'd like to welcome to the stage Michael Mullen of the Express Association of America.
Well, thanks very much, Ken, and it's a delight to be here with you today and have the honor to introduce one of our speakers. So when CEOs are asked what keeps them up at night, the most common answer is uncertainty. The inability to see what's coming next is the major problem with which both business and government planners struggle. So we're fortunate today to have with us Robert Moran, a partner with the Brunswick Group, who has pioneered a highly effective approach to predicting the future by examining the major trends underway today and the direction they are likely to take going forward. Mr. Moran heads Brunswick Insight, a team of public opinion and market research experts spread across 3 continents who provide rapid analysis and strategic advice to support senior decision-making and corporate communications programs. Mr. Moran was previously president of Strategy One's U.S. operations, which is Edelman's strategic research consultancy. Prior to that, he was vice president at Fabrizio McLaughlin and Associates. So please join me in welcoming Robert Moran.
Good morning, and happy Mardi Gras, which Ken mentioned just a minute ago. So at your tables today, you should have this handout, which is an infographic which I'll be speaking from, which covers the 20 trends that I'm going to be walking through today. And what I'm going to do is top line these trends for about 30 minutes and then open it to questions so we can mix it up a bit and have fun with that. So let's get started. So they say that forewarned is forearmed, and our annual Horizon Scan helps leaders prepare for the year ahead. Unfortunately, 2024 is shaping up to be a very turbulent year where resilience is critical. Now, as I'm walking through these trends, I think it's helpful for leaders to think about these as a kind of intellectual sandbox where you start to pressure test what your strategy is for your organization and how each of these trends might impact your organization collectively. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process of how we did this, because I think it's important, as they say, to show our homework here. So every trend that you see is a combination of what foresight experts call STEEP trends. That stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends. So we basically, our team goes and looks at all of the STEEP categories, social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, and then starts to put those together into a forecast for each year. This is a very standard foresight tool. Now, Some of the trends that I'm going to talk about today are what we call long wave or mega trends. These are going to take a generation or longer to go through. So I'm going to give you some examples that aren't in the forecast, but that are just mega trends that everybody needs to be aware of. So global urbanization. The world over time has urbanized at a fairly rapid rate in the 20th and now 21st century. That's one big one, right? The second big one is the rise of the global middle class. Those are, we don't put them in this forecast because those are sort of obvious megatrends. But some of the bigger megatrends I'm talking about today are what really drive society forward, and those are the ones you need to pressure test your business and your organization against. We also have some trends that are much smaller but very stochastic. In other words, they'll pop in any given year. And those are sort of where the wild card scenarios start to come in. Now, there's deep value in connecting different trends. So I'm going to walk you through 20. But what you should be thinking along with me is how might one trend connect to another and create an opportunity or a challenge for your business or organization. I'm going to give you an example that is very common among futurists that futurists always use. The drive-in movie craze of the 50s and 60s in America. So that hit America by storm. People are like, wow, how did that happen? Okay, if you were a futurist, you would have said the following way in advance. America has a baby boom. America loves cars. We have the Eisenhower highway system being built. Americans love movies. You combine youth and mobility and movies with affluence post-war, and you get the drive-in movie. So today, as I'm walking through these, try to think about what the drive-in movie might be of the future for your organization. Okay, now, to explain a little bit more about how we built this forecast, it's important to note that we reviewed 31 different global forecasts and studies from a cross-section of analytical groups, including DARPA, Deloitte, McKinsey, Pew Research Center, Brookings, Gallup, Edelman, WHO, CSIS, World Economic Forum, et cetera. We took a range of their forecasts and studies and made a meta-analysis to build this. We also listened for what are called weak signals, which are very early sort of signals or green shoots of change that we want to take a look at that give us pause, that could be harbingers of a much bigger change in the future. Okay, so with that said, get your infographic ready and I'll walk you through each one of these. So the first is macroeconomic turbulence. That's our biggest driver for the year. Technological disruption would already be enough of a challenge for most organizations. If you think about digitization and AI and everything else that's going on, deep fakes, which we'll talk about momentarily. But we are now dealing with war, power blocks, and managed trade, along with trade protectionism. And all of those combined with the technological disruption we have, and a number of other trends, which I'm going to walk you through, create a less than stable economic system that we are going to experience. And so the likelihood that something not so great happens in this year, and from a macroeconomic standpoint, is pretty high. And so that's why we will need to make sure we're wearing our seatbelts. The second is the empty cradle. So most of the world's societies are aging, and aging dramatically. And this is likely to do a number of things. Number one, it's likely to slow economic growth. Number two, it's likely to bankrupt governments. Number three, it's likely to drive automation because there'll be fewer workers. So because of that worker shortage, you're going to increase automation, especially in sort of nursing home and elder care and things like that. So the challenge here, and we're going to talk about this in relation to Asia in just a minute, is that societies grow the fastest, and those who have an economics background have heard this a million times, but there's something called the demographic window. Societies grow the fastest when they're in the demographic window. That means they have very few children and very few older people, and they have a lot of people in their peak working years. When you get out of that, the economy in that nation tends to slow. And so that will be a bigger problem, not just in Western Europe, but especially in Asia, which has really powered the global economy. The U.S. has a slowing birth rate as well, but as an immigrant society, we have sort of an ability to attract new talent, and other societies don't necessarily have that kind of orientation towards immigration. So societies like America and Brazil, who have been immigration driven, may have the ability to stay younger relative to the rest of the world if they play their immigration cards correctly. That brings us to the third big trend, which is graying Asia. Most nations are aging rapidly. The Pacific Rim has been the world's economic engine, but that engine is going to slow. It's not just, for example, Japan. So most of you are thinking Japan when you think about Asia and aging, but South Korea is aging just as rapidly, if not faster. And the big question then becomes China, which is aging very rapidly. By 2030, China's median age will be 5 years older than the USA, and by 2033, China's old age dependency will be higher than the US. By 2035, 30% of China is projected to be over 60. And deaths in China outnumbered births in 2022. That was the first time since 1961. The old adage is, that China needs to get rich before it gets old. The problem that China has is it's old and getting old quickly. And that's going to slow the global growth rate. And this exacerbates a number of problems that China already has, the so-called 3Ds of debt, deflation, and of course, demography. So graying Asia, or the gray tsunami, is a very significant trend that we're going to see this year, but it's going to play out across time. You also see Xi calling for Chinese women to have more children, and the repeal of the one-child policy, or stepping back away from it, et cetera. And those are all attempts to deal with this challenge. 4, the race for AI superiority. There's a concept in military history called the revolution in military affairs, which posits that the first power to successfully weaponize a new technology gains hegemony. So think bronze, iron, chariots, gunpowder, steam power, air power, atomic weapons, cyber, AI, and now we have AI. So what's going on here is nation states are racing for that superiority to weaponize a new technology. And the first that figures out how to weaponize that technology then has the upper hand. The challenge with AI is it's one of those exponential technologies that's hard for others to catch up to the leader. And that's what every nation state knows, and that's why we have this AI sort of arms race going on. But it's not just nation states, it's also corporations and businesses. And the question is, how will businesses and nation states operate in a way that they can essentially try to gain the upper hand with artificial intelligence? And here I'm talking not just about large language models, but not just about generative AI, which just has made a lot of headlines, but eventually we're talking about artificial general intelligence, which is actual thinking, as opposed to sort of what a large language model is today. Number 5, power blocks. So we are likely living in the early days of World War V. So the First World War was actually the 7 Years' War. The Second World War was World War I. The Third World War was World War II. The Fourth World War was the Cold War. And we are probably in something we will look back on as the Fifth World War. And you can see this in the power blocks that are developing and have been developed over time. And then we have a non-aligned block, just like we had during the Cold War. And that is driving and will drive quite a bit of how we experience 2024. I don't have to go into all the details to talk about the conflict zones in the world that we have right now, including Ukraine, et cetera, and all the discussions around Taiwan, but that is what we are talking about. Number 6, deep fakes and the crisis of authenticity. The question here is what is real and what is not real? And that is something that societies are going to struggle with because of the technology, the deep fake technology that Hollywood, et cetera, are already using. And in the near future, nation states and fraudsters are going to use this to confuse and deceive adversaries. And so, for example, in the near future, some deep fake fraudster is going to replicate a CEO saying something that is not true and not real to try to manipulate the stock market. And we're going to have a discussion about how we regulate this, which will be almost impossible to do. And then we're going to have a discussion about how we authenticate information. And so corporate communicators are going to have to think very long and hard about how we authenticate the communication. My view is it'll probably be authenticated by venue and official sources. And so we're going to have to think through this as a society. The American government and other governments will have to think through this as well. And so deep fakes are something that we will need to come to grips with here, especially in 2024. Number 7, mineral nationalism. We have an issue right now, which is that every major country knows that it needs to make the energy transition. Okay, but the energy transition requires batteries and electrification, and that requires a whole host of minerals, including lithium and copper. And so if you're interested in this topic, you can read the book that just came out, The War Below. But essentially, every major nation state is going to be competing for resources, especially minerals, lithium, copper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to try to friend source those minerals. What it will also mean is that countries like the United States are going to have to expand mining and approve more extraction. They will have to do that. And they will eventually do it for the best of reasons, including for environmental reasons. So there's going to be a discussion around that. Number 8, labor empowerment. This is a trend that we've been tracking for a very long time. You have 2 competing data points. The U.S. is at a relative low in terms of its percentage of unionization, but has the highest public support for unions that it's had in the last 60 years in public polling. And you could see this over the last summer with so-called the hot strike summer and other labor activity. That labor activity within historic standards is still quite low, but was much higher than most years. Labor has not captured all the gains of efficiency that we've made over the last 20, 30 years. And so this is an attempt by the people, by organized labor, to take back some of those gains. So we think that labor empowerment is a trend to watch. It may not look like the old 19th and 20th century labor movements. We're probably talking about unionization of service sector employees and things like this. And it may look more like medieval guilds than 20th century unions. Number 9, sovereign and municipal debt. I think it's fairly obvious that public debt levels are simply unsustainable. You combine them with an aging population and there will be a reckoning. Several sovereigns and U.S. states will likely go bankrupt in the process. Public debt hit a record $92 trillion in 2022, and 3.3 billion people live in countries in which interest payments are greater than spending on health or education. The UN Secretary General of Trade and Development calls global debt one of, quote, the biggest threats to global peace and security. And that will not end well. Okay, number 10, obesity costs. The World Obesity Federation predicts that over half of the global population, 4 billion people, will be obese by 2035. That will create an unsustainable cost for nation states. The healthcare knock-on effects are just simply too great. It's connected to too many NCDs. And so what will happen is governments will be forced to push fitness efforts and weight loss drugs. Now, this was a predictable outcome as the world urbanizes, because as the world urbanizes, it tends to gain weight. So we could have seen this coming, and we did. Obesity costs between 4 and 9% of U.S. GDP annually. And so you could see this will be viewed as a way that we can sort of gain some cost savings by getting the population healthier. Number 11, data security. I won't go too heavily into that. That's been on our radar for a long time. It's now a cost of doing business for most corporations. Eventually, the cost will be so high that nation states will regard it more as a violent attack and less as something that's sort of done in the ether. Number 12, youth mental health. We've been tracking this for years as mental health broadly, which then spiked as an issue during COVID. But the data shows that post-COVID, this crisis is the most acute among teenage girls. And teenage girls are driving a huge percentage of the calls into mental health hotlines, et cetera, and clinical visits. And so nation states around the world are going to be thinking about how they can help teens, and specifically teenage girls, deal with this. So for example, mental health visits grew 20% between 2019 and 2022. Among those under 18, eating disorder visits are up 90%, anxiety-related visits are up 39%, and depression-related visits are up 24%. And 14% of global youth experience mental health concerns, most commonly anxiety and depression. There's a wider issue going on here, which is so-called deaths from despair, which I think you all have heard of and read about before. And this is also part of a much bigger trend about us trying to put context around the mental health impact of COVID and its aftermath, which is a very good New York Times article written about it yesterday. Okay, 13, green energy, which is tied to mining and a range of other things. Is the bottom line is if nation states want to make the energy transition, they need minerals, they need mining. There's no way around it. And essentially, the growth rate is now at a point where green energy and clean tech is really taking off. For example, wind and solar provided 14% of global electricity in the H1 of 2023, up from 12.8% in H1 2022. At some point, you get a critical mass of these technologies, and they just start to build on themselves because they have economies of scale. But the choke point here is minerals. Okay, 14. Climate and conflict mitigation. We raise this because almost everything in our horizon scan this year was bad news and competitive. However, we did see a silver lining here, which is some of these threats to the world in terms of climate conflict are so extreme that they're driving international cooperation as well. And so we do posit that some of the climate and carbon threats may end up being, when historians look back at this time, as something that helped bring the world together as a countervailing trend. Okay, number 15, water and food security. The fact is the world produces enough food to feed everyone. We have a distributional problem, or warlords use it to gain leverage on a population that they want to manage out, et cetera. But the water and food security is a distributional issue generally. Climate change and war have stressed food markets, but the real issue behind all of it is really fresh water. And we are in a freshwater deficit in most of the world. By 2030, the Earth will have a freshwater deficit of 40%, with 1.6 billion people lacking safe drinking water. So 80% of wastewater globally is just discharged untreated. So the world is going to have to come to grips with that, and also trying to manage some of the food security issues we have from conflicts around the world. Number 16, AI productivity. So if we're lucky, AI will end up creating the kind of wealth that the railroads created in America in the 1870s and 1880s. I think that's pretty likely, in fact. Now, I want to try to blow up some of the scaremongering that's happening around AI. There have been 3 phases of discussion around automation and AI. Phase 1 was job automation fears. A number of economists took all the SIC codes, all the job codes in America, thank you, Labor Department, and then ran likelihood of automation estimates for each job code. And if you remember back, this was like 6-8 years ago, there was a lot of fear about what jobs would be automated or not. Okay. That was round 1. Phase 2 was McKinsey and other consulting firms coming in and saying, not so fast, because look, what's going to happen is tradition, cultural acceptance, unions, governments, et cetera, will slow down the rate of automation. The third wave of the discussion, which we are now in, was driven by the Royal Society, which their researchers realized that what's happening here is a job is not a single unit. A job is a task, is a stack of tasks. Each task can be automated. Jobs aren't automated, tasks are automated. If you have a job that is one task, you have a higher rate of automation possibility. But if you have a job that has 30 different tasks, well, one of those tasks may get automated and make you actually a more valuable worker because you can use that technology to produce more. And that's the discussion we're at now. So what will happen is we will learn to race with the machine, not against it. And for most workers, it will make them even more valuable. The question is how workers capture that value. Okay, almost finished. Loneliness epidemic. This is part of the knock-on effects of the decline and unbundling of religion. The WHO made loneliness a global health priority, and research has found a decline in the percentage of people with close friends. So the antidote to this is social capital, is architecture and urban planning that creates new spaces for people to meet, and also festivals that create connection, like Mardi Gras, which we're in today. And so the loneliness epidemic is something that organizations and especially governments are going to look at. Governments about 10 years ago started looking at happiness and trying to study happiness. The UAE spent a lot of money trying to study happiness. But we also need to figure out loneliness and help fight loneliness, which means we need to help people get reconnected. We need to look at societies, cities, people groups that have a high rate of social connection and try to understand how they architect social connection into their lives. Number 18, political polarization. I don't need to tell people in Washington about political polarization. We've lived through it. It is a challenge. It is a challenge for businesses to navigate. 19, this is less germane to a trade-related conference, but autonomous weapon swarms are going to be a big deal. And what I mean by this is imagine thousands of drones operating together sort of as a swarm, collectively, autonomously. And this allows an aggressor to use a cheaper technology, drones, to attack a larger defensive fixed target. We've had this push and pull in military history over the years. You can go back to longbows and knights. You have knights at the apex of society with all the armor and all the attendants and everything else in a society built around that warrior class that could then be killed by a simple archer with a longbow. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. So the societies and the militaries that learn to advance very large, we're talking about thousands of drones working together to attack targets, will have military hegemony. And then finally, grid hardening. Okay, on September 2nd, 1859, in the American West, telegraph operators saw sparks coming off their telegraphs. All sorts of weird things happened with anything that had wiring. Fortunately, we didn't have many things with wiring in 1859. We had telegraphs, and telegraphs went crazy on September 2nd, 1859. Why? The people at the time didn't know why. What had happened was the sun had emitted a plasma, and it hit North America really hard. This happens every couple centuries. It happens all the time in limited bursts. It happened in Montreal back in the 1990s and shut down power for a while. And it's called a Carrington event. You can Google it and read all about it. It's fascinating. But it's essentially nature's version of an EMP attack, okay? Every major country knows about these, and they know what a threat it is, because either it happens naturally from the sun or it happens from an aggressor, but it knocks out your grid. You've seen in the Ukraine conflict how important the grid is. And so if a nation state's grid is knocked out, it can be knocked out for a long time if it is EMP'd. And so you're going to see nation states around the world hardening their grids, which will create economic incentives to basically build more resilience into all of the core infrastructure. Okay, so those are our 20 trends for 2024, and happy to take questions for a few minutes. Great. Yep.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for this great presentation. And on the grid hardening, I live here in Arlington, Virginia, where a small windstorm can knock out our electricity. So grid hardening would be a good thing, at least locally, I would think, in some places. Can I ask you just a little bit about your trends? And can you help us understand root causes versus impacts? So I think in the international trade space, we're seeing a lot of protectionism in the United States. I think that's rising out of fears among non-college educated men, primarily. That's driving some of the things you have here in your trends, other factors as well. But I'm just wondering, maybe if you could articulate a little bit, which of these are kind of root issues and which of these are kind of the secondary effects of what are probably some root issues that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, the root issues are really driven, so the root issues are really around technological change and who wins and who loses, and the losers trying to catch up in what they're doing, and also nation-state rivalry. But to talk a little bit more about protectionism, this was about 8 years ago. We ran a very large global study asking a range of questions about how people think about the future, et cetera. And when we started looking at the data, what we realized was people who lived in global megacities across the world, didn't matter what society they were in, had similar views, which were much more optimistic about the world. If you weren't living in a global megacity, you were much more pessimistic, and you felt like you were falling behind. And so this was before the 2016 election that we saw this, but it really raised the question about what's going on here. And the answer is that basically folks who are tied into a global megacity, who are part of the international sort of economic community that's driving forward, they're getting more of the gains than people in second and third tier cities are. And so they have very radically different views. And so that's why you could see this in our politics around the world to this day. Yes.
I'd rather talk about trade than obesity, but you fascinate me by saying that obesity is such a big problem that it costs so much that we have to do something about it. The worry would be that the government has to tell you what you can eat and what you can weigh, and that would not be a good thing.
So it might not be the government, it might be, other organizations, your employer, other things like that. But if you look at it, non-communicable diseases are a huge cost driver in health systems, right? And so obesity has a number of knock-on non-communicable diseases, especially diabetes. And so the question is, how do we help people get fitter? Because simply it's a huge cost. And so, you can have discussions about sort of energy balance and walking cities and walking places and that kind of a thing. But over time, I expect a technological or pharmacological fix is what people will go for. Or some other semaglutide.
Hi, you talked about the importance of minerals, lithium and all of that. What are the implications in terms of geopolitics as it relates to most of those minerals are on the continent of Africa?
That's right. That's a great point. So I'm going to go back to my notes here. So as you pointed out, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chile, and others have announced new taxes and/or export bans on minerals. Now, the United States, from its perspective, is going to look at how to friend source minerals from various countries, but we'll also have to ramp up domestic production. And there are articles every day coming out about potential lithium mining in the United States, but copper is important. Now, an interesting thing for sort of hemispheric trade in the Western Hemisphere is that the U.S. has a number of these minerals, but miners are not allowed yet to access them. But also, Latin America, South America is blessed with an enormous amount of the minerals needed for production of batteries. And so I suspect that you're going to see this big surge in hemispheric trade in order to secure all those materials. There's a secondary issue in regards to some of these countries, which is that there is a question around essentially worker treatment and how those minerals are processed. So traditionally, a warlord will take control of the smelter and essentially enslave the people who are providing the minerals and the smelting. And so how societies deal with that and sort of labor standards in regards to that extraction is going to be a very, very big deal as well. But I think the big impact, at least in this country, is going to be the country will have to have a conversation. The conversation will ultimately end in the decision to allow a lot more mining, because it's the only way we can get the energy transition done. So eventually, a critical mass of environmentalists will support new mining, because it's the only way we can support the battery technology to get the energy transition that we want, which is probably a hard pill to swallow for many environmentalists, but I think is inevitable at this point.
I don't see any reference to guns. What do you think? I mean, do you think American or world gun policy needs to change, will change? You talk about other kinds of, because I was even relating it when you talked about youth mental health and about the problem with girls. The one advantage girls have is they have less exposure generally to guns. As I understand it, boys have a higher suicide rate because they are successful committing suicide. So between crime and mental health.
So this is a global forecast, and America has a unique gun culture. And not only that, but we tend not to talk about this in crime generally because it's a sort of base level issue for most societies. But the issue is if we were to do that, if we were to talk about firearms and this was a simply American focus, then we would be having a different discussion. But this is a global, and other countries have very different gun cultures, as you know. So.
Are you optimistic? In other words, is this all going to turn out okay, or are we heading towards some huge catastrophe, which any one of these 20 things could produce?
So I'm by nature an optimist, personally. But that's probably because of my cultural matrix as an American. If you look at all these together, we'll be lucky to get out of the next 20 years without a major global conflict. We'll be lucky to get out of this without a Great Depression. It's hard to look at this and have a lot of optimism. Now, humans are very resilient and resourceful, and we've been through world wars, we've been through global depressions, but if you look at this, I think any analysis is pretty stark about this. You could see that most nation states are acting from a point of view that there are some challenges ahead. So, not to bring everyone down, but we're going to be lucky to get out of this one okay.
We have a question from our audience on Zoom. Do you think these trends will end up making people, and more importantly, companies, feel more liberal or protective about their proprietary data? Will they be less willing to share more digital benefits, or will they be willing to share to avoid potential exploitation of their data?
So I suspect that organizations and especially companies are going to look at their information as a value source and source of competitive advantage and try to put walled gardens around that data. You see this right now with a number of legal wranglings around large language models and authors suing the makers of large language models. From a purely capitalistic standpoint, if I have a corporation and I have valuable data, I don't want to share it. I want to monetize it. And my stakeholders, especially my shareholders, expect me to do so. So there's not really a lot of incentive for me to share information. Nation states are very different. I mean, we're blessed. Most of us are living in the United States who are listening to this, and we have fantastic data sources from our government, which are open source and remarkably accurate. And so I think those data points can be mined, like BLS data, et cetera. But I suspect that most corporations and most businesses will build walled gardens around their data to protect that value.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about all of these trends and these forecasts. I like the way that you started off the discussion discussing on behalf of sort of futurists. And what I wanted to ask you was, considering, the aging working population, but also coupled with advancing technology the way that it is, and sort of also the way you speak about, youth mental health and the way that young people are starting to work. My question is, coupled with all of these things kept in mind, how do futurists envision, bringing people back to the workspace, using technology as a tool, but also, in an age of extreme political polarization, how do futurists see bringing people back into these sorts of workspaces?
Right. So that's a wonderful question. And, I think right now we've been in this long-term discussion now ever since COVID about what the workplace is and what it's meant to do and designed to do. So keep in mind when we went through COVID and we shut down a range of business activities or convening activities, we kept the physical workplaces for essential workers open, like hospitals, nurses, production, meat packing, all that kind of stuff. A huge range of Americans, a huge range of workers have to go to a physical place to do their work. So think people that work at the pharmacy, any essential workers, people that deliver the mail, people who are making products, people who are shipping food, all that. All that is a physically linked job. Then there are people that can do, intellectual workers that can do their job remotely. I think for that category, the question is, what is a workplace? And what is a workplace for? I suspect it is for social connection and new ideas ultimately in the future, and not necessarily for like day-to-day work. But I also want to expand people's view about what a workplace could look like in the future. So, and I just finished a novel in which some of the villains meet in cyberspace in a video game, and like many terrorist organizations, they meet in a video game and plan their attacks. So, but what if that's what work looks like in the future, where you work in VR in a game? So during COVID, for example, some people met in Red Dead Redemption, the video game, and they met around the campfire and talked, and that's where I got inspiration in my novel for. But the workplace could look like that, where you meet in VR and a global team meets. So we don't know exactly what that looks like, but humans are tribes and they create folkways. And so I think in reality, what corporations need to do is think more about the workforce from an anthropological and sociological perspective. What are the folkways, right? And what gives people meaning? Humans have a deep need for contribution and being part of a team. And so I think the workplace of the future allows them to feel that, and routine is really important. Getting coffee, people taking smoke breaks, whatever it is, those kind of routines are what are the fabric of life. And so that's why you hear some corporate leaders really wanting people back in the office. I think it's going to be some kind of a hybrid approach, but it's a really interesting issue. And just to follow up on this on one other thing, futurists talk about quite a bit, which is that you have two other big trends going on. One is the individual as their own corporation, right? The side hustle, the side gig, all that kind of stuff, and people using other workspaces anywhere, cafes, et cetera, because they are a corporation of one, right? So you have that, plus you have in larger employers, multiple generations having to figure out how to work together. And this is a real big challenge right now. You've got Gen Z, you've got millennials, you've got Gen X, and you have boomers. Four very different generations within the American context. Each society has a somewhat different structure in that. But in the American context, 4 generations trying to find out ways to work together who have very different political views and philosophical views, all banging into each other in the workplace. And so corporations are really struggling with that as well.
Thank you. Well, 2 questions quickly. On your number 5, do you really consider BRICS as a bloc or as a sort of grouping of people with very conflicting interests? And if your 20 points as a whole are sort of huge challenge, aren't most of these points huge opportunities for companies like obesity? That means if you are a pharmaceutical company, it's billions, trillions of dollars.
Yes, that's right. That's right. There's a lot of opportunity in these forecasts, especially for like defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, you name it, mobility, water treatment. Water treatment's a huge long-term trend. Even concrete, which is not exactly the environmentalist's favorite building material, but future's pretty bright for aggregates, construction materials. Okay, one last question. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. You talked about labor and grid hardening and AI, and there's often talk about immigration reform. So are corporations afraid of losing the ability to engage in the international trade for skilled laborers, for example, extraordinary ability, exceptional ability, other skilled laborers like IT? Mm-hmm. So are corporations afraid of losing this edge of continuing to basically maintain a foothold in world hegemony in their sectors?
So to answer the questions really quickly, yes, and the United States and other nations will eventually reform their immigration laws in an effort to basically grab the tech workers that they need for the future, but also to increase immigration levels so that the societies don't age as rapidly. So that, the United States should increase immigration levels so that we do not age as rapidly and we can continue to grow. So that's a very rational strategy. Tax policy, given the debt levels and spending, nation states will have no recourse but to basically cut their debt and increase taxes. They're going to go after tax havens and any other sort of alternative investments that are trying to get around those. So I don't see how you can't get around that without, as a nation state, raising taxes and going after tax havens. Okay, thank you.
Welcome back. I am very honored to welcome our next discussion. The importance of America's manufacturing sector has been top priority for the past 2 administrations, and trade policy has been a crucial tool in their efforts to bolster American manufacturing might and help it thrive in a competitive global marketplace. The National Association of Manufacturers is the point of that spear, and we couldn't be more pleased than to host their president and CEO, Jay Timmons, to talk about how trade can support America's vital manufacturing sector. Jay is joined on stage by the man behind the pen, who's been telling us the story about trade policy for over 20 years, Doug Palmer of Politico. Doug?
Great. Thanks very much. As Ken said, I'm Doug Palmer with Politico, and I'm pleased to be here with Jay Timmons, who's president and CEO.
I'll answer anything. It's okay.
Of the National Association of Manufacturers, and you've been president there since I think president and CEO since 2011.
Yeah, if I was under deposition, I'm not sure I'd remember what the date was, but I think it was 2011. That sounds about right.
Well, I was impressed because I looked at your bio and I saw that you came to Washington in like the 1980s, and you worked as a press secretary for, I think, a pair of different congressmen.
So I actually dropped out of college because I wanted to be part of, ironically, where we're sitting, the Reagan Revolution, and never got a chance to actually work in the Reagan White House, but it was always my dream. And he was really kind of my inspiration and what really motivated me. His, if you will, his worldview really impressed me. And
right.
I couldn't do it there, but I was able to work for some members on Capitol Hill who were working to enact his agenda.
Right. And then I saw that you worked for Governor Allen, both when he was on the Hill and then when he was in the governor's.
Yeah, so later, so the congressmen were from North Carolina. Later, I worked for George Allen when he was a congressman, governor, senator.
Yeah.
And he was probably the younger version of Reagan in my mind anyway. So.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, I guess I would just ask you to start off by, could you give us a brief overview of what are NAM's trade priorities for the year? And then I thought that maybe we could dig into some issues. I've been thinking a lot about the WTO ministerial in a couple of weeks. And I know you guys are interested in seeing some trade legislation moved, and also are sort of frustrated that trade agreements aren't being negotiated. So I thought we could talk about that. But maybe if you could
That's a wrap.
if you could start off with a brief overview of what you'd like to see done in 2024.
Yeah, so, the NAM was founded in 1895, Doug, and you and I have talked about this. We were really founded under the belief that we need to expand our access to markets around the world. Later, we got more involved in domestic policy. But our goal was to recognize the important place that American manufacturers had on the world economy. And so that was really the impetus for the birth of the NAM. And that's really been part of our DNA for all that time. What is that now, 129 years of the existence of our organization. But I think we look at trade, and I know our members do. So I have a very small and discreet board of directors of 250 members.
Right.
And the good news is that all of them, regardless of their size, whether they're multinational companies or the smallest mom and pop manufacturer, understand the importance of a liberalized system of trade around the world, because they know that that's good for their success, it's good for their communities' success. I was just speaking to Ambassador Moctezuma, who I think will be speaking here in just a little bit. And, he was making the point, and he makes it much more eloquently than I could, but that trade is really the recipe for peace and the recipe for working together harmoniously. So I think we look at trade through that lens, and we look at trade as a facilitator to obviously economic growth, but also the export, if you will, of our values and the American style of democracy. So some of our objectives, well, first and foremost, we'd like to see more trade agreements. We haven't seen one negotiated here in the United States for over 10 years, and the rest of the world, quite frankly, is they're eating our lunch when it comes to negotiating these agreements. Very simple issues like what you would think they would be simple issues, like the miscellaneous tariff bill, getting that done, gets locked up with all of the partisan back and forth. And an issue like that, I just don't quite understand it. I would probably add on to all of that issues that directly impact our ability to grow manufacturing in the United States so that we can trade. So I think of a stable tax policy. The tax reforms that we achieved in 2017 were incredibly important to manufacturers' ability to invest and hire and grow wages here in the United States. Regulatory certainty is critical for manufacturers to be able to compete here in the United States. Immigration reform is going to be important because we can invest all we want in manufacturing in the United States so that we can be a world leader, but if we don't have the people to do the jobs that we have open, right now 620,000, I think, in the manufacturing sector, we're not going to be able to aspire or to meet the aspirations that we have for being that global leader on trade or to continue to be that global leader. So all of those are kind of part of the NAM legislative and regulatory basket.
Well, thanks for that overview. I'd like to dig into the ministerial conference a little bit, the WTO ministerial. I mean, there's not a lot on that agenda to get manufacturers excited, I don't believe, but I know that you're worried about at least one thing, which is this COVID-19, this push for the expanded TRIPS waiver to cover therapeutics and diagnostics. Yeah. Why would that be a bad development from your point of view?
Well, look, I mean, intellectual property is truly the lifeblood of manufacturing. You know, we work pretty hard, and it's always been kind of a given from the U.S. perspective that intellectual property protections would be front and center. We saw the original TRIPS waiver with regard to the vaccine and the properties of the vaccine occur, and we were concerned about that. Obviously, we want to facilitate the growth of manufacturing in other areas of the world too, and we know that there are other ways to achieve what I think WTO was trying to achieve. But this is really that was a step too far. This is a giant leap too far if therapeutics and diagnostics are included in the waiver, an expanded waiver. I just don't know how you message to manufacturers if your government says okay to that, first and foremost, or if WTO does. But even if we're not exactly sure where we're going to see our government come down on that,
right?
If they give the green light, how then do they turn around and say, oh, by the way, we want you to invest in developing more innovations here in this country if we're just going to turn around and give them away? It's a similar issue, which is not directly related to trade, but march-in rights is another issue that this administration is talking about implementing, which is the ability of the government to march in and take intellectual property or a patent away from a company if the government has been involved in helping to develop that particular product or patent. And so I think we're getting a rather mixed message. I would tell you today, and I say this all the time, I think this president is probably has a bigger heart for manufacturing than any I've worked with. And Ken mentioned that trade has been a priority for President Trump and President Biden, or I should say that the agenda has been front and center. I would say that the manufacturing agenda was front and center. I would say that manufacturing has been present for all of the presidents I've seen in action since Reagan, but in different ways. And I think we've reached a point where we have this amazing opportunity to see manufacturing truly just explode in terms of growth here in this country because of the focus on trade by by Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, because of the focus on competitive tax policy by the last administration, as well as regulatory certainty, because of the investments in chips and science and infrastructure, and even some of the policy provisions that President Biden pushed. All of that has led us to this pivotal point in the ability of manufacturing to really succeed in this country. But if we start chipping away at that progress by saying, at the very least, you can't protect a patent or you can't protect your intellectual property,
Right.
I don't think that's the right signal to be sending for further manufacturing investment.
Right. On the other hand, my understanding is that no country has actually used that vaccine waiver. So, and people who are on the other side of the issue argue, what the WTO approved in June 22 wasn't really all that significant. So, since no country actually used it, I mean, is it an exaggeration to get concerned about the therapeutics and diagnostics piece of it? I mean, maybe that would be equally as ineffective.
Well, whether it's effective or not, I think you're sending a message that you really do not respect the intellectual property rights of manufacturers.
Right.
So if you apply that theory to other products, whether they're biologics or pharmaceuticals or it could be anything, right?
Right. I mean, people talk about maybe this would set a precedence for green technologies or something.
Well, sure. There's green technology. I mean, there's tractors. I mean, you could apply this same theory to any product. So I think it's in manufacturers' best interest to protect that pretty basic value.
Right. Well, there's another issue at MC13 that I believe is important to NAM, and that's this 26-year-old moratorium on collecting collecting duties on e-commerce transmissions. Right. I mean, that seems to be mainly like digital goods, like DVDs or the digital versions of like movies on DVDs or music on CDs. But also people say, though, that electronic transmissions is a really vague term. It could literally cover any sort of business transaction that crosses borders electronically.
Well, that's our worry, right?
Right. So, I mean, I guess, how concerned are you?
Why is it a problem?
Yeah, why is it?
So I think, I think it comes down to your basic philosophy of whether you want to facilitate more trade, which I think most economists would say that is good for economic activity, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to continue to grow economies around the world, or whether you want to impede trade. Tariffs, also known as taxes, impede economic activity.
Right.
That's pretty basic. And sometimes governments want to do that for various reasons. I'm not sure why we would want to impede the ability of companies to grow and to innovate unless you're trying to send a signal that we should only be innovating here. Mm-hmm. And we should only be creating here. And I don't think in a global economy, and whether politically that resonates or not, a global economy,
right.
It's a fact. And I want to see our products treated fairly, and I want to make sure that our products have the opportunity to be exported and purchased by whether that is digital or electronic or a traditional manufactured good. Mm-hmm. I want the opportunity to sell those products to the 95% of the customers who live outside of the United States.
Right. Well, I'm a reporter. I'm going to be covering the WTO ministerial, and I'm hoping there's like a little bit of drama in that meeting. And I was wondering...
We'll create it for you.
Well, like, what if, for example, Catherine Tai is forced to choose between trying to get a continuation of the e-commerce moratorium or giving in on the TRIPS, an expansion of the TRIPS waiver. I mean, what if she's sort of presented as with that as a choice. In order to get consensus to do one thing or another, is there one issue that she should go with? I mean, which of those is more important to you?
I'm going to state it another way. There is no instance where the United States should ever be forced into a position of compromise, period.
Okay.
And we just have to simply lead. And we have to lead not only there, but we have to lead in Geneva, right, at the WTO for issues like dispute settlement, the resolution on that.
Right.
We have to step up to the plate. Now, we're not sending necessarily the best message to the rest of the world when we go into these conferences if we're not willing to consider more free trade agreements around the world, if we're not leading in terms of expanding trade around the world, and we haven't been doing that. We haven't been doing that for a long time, over a decade, right? So I kind of reject the premise of your question there because I simply don't expect the United States is going to be forced to make to compromise.
Well, we'll see.
Or should it be?
We'll see what happens. Maybe I planted an idea. Okay. Well, on the subject of like U.S. leadership, I mean that's kind of been on my mind too, heading into this ministerial. It sounds like you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that it's not leading on trade to the extent that it has in the past. I listened to a speech that Ambassador Tai gave in October or September at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she talked about how the U.S. is a champion of the rules-based international trade system. And I just wondered, can the U.S. still really claim to be a champion of the rules-based international trade system? I mean, given that it's taken apart the dispute settlement system, or at least it's effectively killed the appellate body. It imposed those tariffs in the name of national security, which you can agree or disagree with.
The 232s? The
232s. But the WTO did rule against it, and we said that we're not going to abide by that ruling. The China 301 tariffs, they were also ruled against by the WTO. I think the administration argues that, well, they worked out that bilaterally with China. But and then we've passed things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains all these discriminatory provisions that seem to violate, most favored nation, treatment under the WTO rules. So I don't know. Are we still a champion of the rules-based international trade system?
Well, I think we should be. Okay. And I think that, look, I'm an unabashed free market proponent, and I think those rules should be based on market economies and not command economies. And I think that is truly the conflict that we have, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. I mean, we look at a country like China, which is treated as a developing economy at the WTO, which absolutely makes no sense whatsoever.
Right.
And we have a choice to make. And sometimes, do we do it right all the time? No, of course not. Do we aspire to do it right all the time? I would hope so. I hope that is our goal. I hope it's the goal of any elected leader and any administration. I give a lot of credit to this president for his foreign policy, his outreach with regard to foreign policy. That can translate into good relationships on the trade front as well. But look, I go back to, and I'm not sure how many folks agree with this, but I truly believe that free market economies and democracies generally need to stand up for that rules-based system. Because if we don't, it's a very different way of life if the command structure takes over.
Right.
And I'm concerned about where that leads, because it's not going to stop in terms of economic policy. It will devolve into forms of government and systems that freedom-loving people do not accept.
Right, right. I have a few more questions, but I do plan to leave some time at the end for audience questions. So if you have some, be thinking about those. Turning to Congress, I mean, you mentioned the miscellaneous tariff bill, which I believe has been expired for a number of years.
3 years, I think.
So what is, I mean, you talked about the partisan bickering and that being the holdup. Well, what do you see as the prospects? I mean, are you optimistic that anything is going to get done in this election year, or is it another year going to come and go and hopefully get it done in 2025?
Well, it depends on the day whether I'm optimistic or not, right? Woke up this morning and I got really optimistic when the Senate passed the foreign aid bill.
Right.
When it goes to the House, ask me then how I feel. But look, I think you can get things done in Congress. And the most important thing for manufacturers and for anybody here who's representing a manufacturing company is to tell our story and to explain, okay, why does this really matter? You want to stop the threats to our national security when it comes to the production of semiconductor chips. You want to build more fabs here. Well, you got to have all the input materials to go into that. Some of those things we simply do not make here. Okay, right. The next question is, well, why don't you make it here? And then my response is going to be, are you going to let me permit a mine? Because it takes 15 years. What do you think the world's going to look like in the year 2039 if we don't get this done now? Right. So we need MTB to, not just to meet our economic goals and not just to feed the supply chains of manufacturers, but also to meet our national security objectives. Some that, we came together on a bipartisan basis on chips and science.
Right.
That was frankly that was a high point, I think, for our government when we did that. Now we got to make sure that all those ancillary issues that go into making chips here in the United States get resolved. MTB is one of those. Permitting reform is another. Tax policy, regulatory policy, all of that will be important.
Right.
And then ultimately, hopefully, trade policy.
Right, right.
And you can see the same thing. I'm going on a tangent here,
yeah.
But you can see the same thing when we talk about climate change and we talk about decarbonization. Mm-hmm. Set aside how anybody feels about those issues, right? But if our goal is less carbon emissions globally, not just here in the United States, why would we restrict LNG exports, especially to Europe, which, oh, by the way, let's throw in our foreign policy objectives because we want Europe to be less reliant on Russian gas, which, is dirtier than U.S. natural gas,
right.
And reliance on coal. Makes no sense. So these are conversations we're having with the administration. Let's be consistent, right? You want to decarbonize, or you want to lower carbon emissions? Well, then let's use what we've got here in this country, what we're manufacturing, what we're producing in terms of LNG, and get it to Europe as quickly as possible.
Right. But speaking of, being optimistic one day, pessimistic the other, I mean, I remember after the Republicans won back control of the House in the prior election, that there was some optimism that trade might actually be on the Republicans' agenda and they might advance, trade legislation. But that doesn't really seem to have happened.
It's got to start at the administration, the White House level, right? I really, truly believe that. I personally would like to see Trade Promotion Authority just be continuous instead of renewed every few years. I just don't understand that, why that happens.
Right.
I know it provides good jobs for a lot of lobbyists, but it makes no sense to me. Put that into effect. Give the president, whoever he or she is, the authority to negotiate free trade agreements, and let's just do more of those, right? I think it's hard, though, for Congress, without the leadership from the White House, to really move anything on the trade front.
Right.
Because there's some radioactive issues in their minds anyway.
Yeah. Do you think if Well, I mean, what do you think? If Biden is reelected, do you think there's more chance for what we sort of know as traditional free trade agreements in a second Biden term?
Not sure about that.
Yeah.
I certainly, I haven't gotten any warm fuzzies on that from this
Okay,
administration,
I see.
but I haven't from the previous administration either. So I think whoever the American people select as their next president, I think we're going to have challenges on this front. And I do think it's our job, again, to explain why trade is good for communities all across this country. We tell a really bad story. We've never perfected how to explain the benefits that small communities like where I was from, Chillicothe, Ohio, a small community in southern Ohio, it has benefited from being able to export products that are made right there. The jobs that are provided, by the way, the highest paying jobs of any sector of the economy, right there in Chillicothe, Ohio, and up the road in Circleville. If you talk to folks back home, I went to, those of you who are familiar with Ohio know that Circleville is the home of the Circleville Pumpkin Show, the greatest free show on earth. And if you don't know that, I'll be happy to tell you all about it later. I was there last year, and I was just talking to folks in the crowd. It's a huge, huge festival. And talking to folks I went to high school with and others, and we talk about trade, and man, they are just anti-trade. We got to.
Wow.
It's got to be America only. We're kowtowing to the rest of the world. And when I start talking about the Sofitel plant right down the road and all the jobs that it created there when it opened up in 2017, I think, so much of their product is being exported. They can't make that connection. And I think it's because we've allowed the partisans, frankly, to control the narrative. And it's time for the business community to control the narrative.
Right. Well, I mean, kind of tying two things together, miscellaneous tariff bill, that waives tariffs on inputs that manufacturers need to make products in the United States. I mean, President Trump, his campaign is talking about it, putting a 10% tariff on all products coming into the United States.
60% from
and
China.
And 60% from China. I mean, what would that do to manufacturing in the United States?
Well, it would, I think the first question you have to ask is not what would happen to manufacturing in the United States from that specific action,
right,
but what would happen to the liberalized system of trade around the world when retaliatory tariffs are implemented, right? I mean, this is not just a shot you get to take without getting return fire. It's going to happen. I think we know the answer to that if we read the history books and we see what happened before the Great Depression. We keep testing and testing and testing those boundaries. At some point, the system collapses. So I think that's probably what would end up happening, right? I mean, and by the way, it's not just Trump.
Right.
Both parties dally with tariffs. I think they've been, not that I agree with them.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm not passing judgment. I'm just saying that there have been a lot of very specific targeted tariffs over the course of the last few years. But if they're broadly applied, I think you're really asking for trouble.
Right. We talked a little bit about free trade agreements, your frustration that the administration is not out there negotiating more. There is, I mean, Congress in 2019, 2020, I remember, did pass the renegotiated NAFTA agreement, the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement. We're coming up on the 4th anniversary of that. How do you think that's working out?
Well, look, we have a few issues.
Yeah.
Mexico has a few issues. Canada has a few issues. But that's the nature of agreements, and it's also why I'm actually fairly encouraged. We had the Three Amigos Summit in Mexico City last year. The major focus of that was not just about the border and national security, but also about the free trade agreement. The ministers met in Cancun in July, and I had the opportunity. I was pleased to lead the business delegation to that. And I think that I think what I see from all sides is they want this to work. They're going to figure out all of these issues that are out there, whether they're issues with energy supply or agricultural products. These are issues that can be resolved. And I go back to one of my previous statements, or paraphrasing it. This agreement is incredibly important to our national security, and it is important to our place in the world. We need to expand the relationship, whether it's trade or other relationships here in North America, and we need to embrace the relationships and the allied and our allies around the world in Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and other areas, because we are facing a choice. We're facing a choice between free market economies and democracies and command economies and autocracies. And I want to strengthen the former,
right,
not allow the latter to start to bloom.
Okay. I'd like to pause and see if there's any questions out in the audience. I see this gentleman way in the back, so why don't we start with him? I think wait for a microphone to come your way. Yeah, the gentleman right there.
Rob Tobias, and I'm formerly with U.S. Treasury. Now I'm with the National Association of Beverage Importers, as in alcohol. My question builds off of your admiration of Ronald.
By the way, one of my most favorite manufactured products.
In good times or bad times, there will always be a need.
At Tuesday,
I will always be employable.
Couldn't be any better.
And all people do is trade up or trade down, depending on the good time or bad times. But I divert. Building off your admiration of Ronald Reagan, a little background. I was a student at UC Berkeley when it was Governor Reagan, and I was in my third year of Washington with my first job at Treasury when it was President Reagan. Having experienced that, I mean, I won't say would you agree, or what are your thoughts on the proponent that Reaganomics basically has set the economic stage for the last 40 years in this country, and that really forms the roots of the anger against free trade that you saw in Ohio. My minister is from North Carolina. He says that anybody who ever votes in favor of free trade will never get a North Carolinian vote because of the closing of the textile mills. I think, and I believe many of President Trump's supporters are demonstrating that anger. So the question is, do you think the foundation of that anger dates from the long-term impact of Reaganomics, and whether President Biden's executive order on promoting competition can correct that? Thank you.
Well, how long you got? So I suppose there are some roots that go back to the Reagan years. And you mentioned the term Reaganomics, which I think is intriguing because I haven't heard that for a while. I really think that we are the only way we're going to deal with the frustrations in these communities, and by the way, the congressman I worked for when I first came here in the 1980s, one of them was Alec McMillan, one of them was Jim Martin, and they were all over the textile bill. And I can't even recall what the actual title of it was, but we were scrambling to try to save textile mills all over the South. I think of some of my manufacturers like Milliken in South Carolina who have navigated through all of that, and they're quite successful. And by the way, they're exporters of their product. There are success stories, and then there are stories that are frustrating, that folks grab onto, and they refuse to see the bright silver linings that do occur when you expand opportunities for trade around the world. And I'm going to go right back to what I think is our obligation as business leaders, is to tell that story better. Oftentimes, a lot of my companies, and I don't blame them, right? They're just trying to deal with the day-to-day work and operate their companies effectively and efficiently and profitably. And they don't want to have to tell that story, which is why, frankly, they have organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers to help tell that story. But we have to invest in those stories, and we have to tell the positive stories of what trade liberalization has done. Have there been issues? Sure, there have been issues. I don't think that we would have seen companies leaving, or I should say investing in other parts of the world if we had other policies supporting a liberalized trade agenda. And I'll go back to the very first thing we talked about. We need tax policy that incentivizes investment here. We need regulatory certainty that gives business leaders the ability to plan for the future. We need to invest in workforce incentives. All of those, and infrastructure, which we have done and we continue to do. You can't just open up the trading system and not expect capital to flow outside of our borders if you don't have the right policies internally. That's where we failed. And that's what we developed over the course of the last 30 years was, I think, an understanding that we had to have those policies in place. So I feel much better about where we are in terms of public policy, although we have certainly some challenges, today than we were, say, 10, 20, even 30 years ago.
Thank you.
Thanks. You touched on an important point where there's a lot of rhetoric in support of American manufacturing, but actually actions that either don't support it or actually undermine the ability to promote manufacturing in the U.S. Yeah. And I think about some of those things. When you look at tools that are available, the U.S. Foreign Trade Zone program is one of the oldest trade programs designed to promote the location of manufacturing in the U.S., creating American jobs, promoting global commerce and U.S. exports. And many manufacturers based in the U.S. use the Foreign Trade Zone program, particularly in industries like automotive and pharmaceuticals, which have inverted tariffs, which the program is designed to help them address in their in global competition. And you mentioned South Carolina. The BMW, which is located in upstate South Carolina, is the largest exporter of U.S. manufactured automobiles. And they operate in a foreign trade zone, as do their suppliers located there. And Michelin being extraordinarily successful, and it has really turned South Carolina into a manufacturing and exporting powerhouse. But when you look, a lot of policymakers really don't know much about the Foreign Trade Zone program, and to the extent that they do, it's got a bad rap. And there's a great deal of reluctance to do anything to support or enhance that program in ways that will promote its goals. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Couldn't tell you. And I'd just bluntly, Ken Monahan, who runs our international trade division, is much better at helping answer that. So I can't really get into it, but I will say that I do know that BMW does take advantage of that program, and I know that when she was governor, Nikki Haley spoke to our board and used that as one of the incentives, if you will, or one of the reasons to invest in South Carolina, as she very deftly twisted the arms of a lot of my members to try to come to her state. So from what I understand about it, which is very little, it's been successful in those types of investments. But I'm going to let Ken be the guy that answers that afterwards.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I'm going to build on Doug's question and also a theme that you keep repeating about the story of manufacturing.
I can't see you. Where are you?
She's right here.
Oh, there you go.
She's in the
Sorry.
purple.
Also Mardi Gras.
So anyway, Catherine Tai spoke earlier this week, and one of the questions she received was, why have you kept all the Section 301 tariffs? And the questioner cited a report from an economist who said they didn't add jobs in the heartland, they didn't add manufacturing jobs, but they did help Trump and the Republican Party. And her answer, I'm going to quote it to you, was, "You're right that we have kept a lot of the tariffs because we see strategic values in those tariffs in this exercise of building up the middle class and reinvigorating American manufacturing." So if this administration believes that tariffs are helping manufacturing, and the next administration believes that even more tariffs will help manufacturing, what do you think could change this narrative? Is it that you need to convince the unions to change their tune? Is it if the 10% tariffs were to come into force and they hit also Canada and Mexico, do you need to convince Congress to change the law and overrule it? Like, what will change this trend? Or do you think we're just going to see more and more tariffs over the next 6 years, or no reduction in tariffs because there is this belief it's saving manufacturing?
Well, I can tell you that the workers at Stanley Black & Decker would tell you very quickly that the 301s are not working because they've lost some of their colleagues to layoffs because the 301s created a system where a drill coming in from China that was fully assembled is less expensive than a drill that's assembled here because of the component parts that are being tariffed coming in to Stanley Black & Decker, and the fully finished drill that's coming in from China was not being tariffed. So it's a system that's been set up in a way that is not equitable for many American manufacturers. I think, too, that because of issues like that, USTR needs to get their review process completed in terms of the exclusions, because we are harming manufacturers in America who are unable to produce some of the parts that are involved in the supply chain for a finished good. And we are, I'm not sure why anybody would think it's good to increase the cost of a product and make a manufacturer in America less competitive. But that's what's happened with many of those 301s, especially when the exclusion process, I think, is arbitrary in many cases, very opaque. Some have gotten their exclusion, some have not. Folks don't really understand how this is working. So I think first and foremost, before we start talking about how good, before any elected official or appointed official starts talking about how good tariffs are, they need to look at the results of how these tariffs have been applied to some manufacturers here in America, and how that's actually cost jobs for American manufacturing workers.
I think we're getting near the end of our time. But on the 301 tariffs, it sounds like you're only talking about exclusions. You're not expecting them to do away with the 301 tariffs.
Well, it doesn't look like it at this point, but I would certainly advocate that that's probably not the best solution for trying to deal with trade imbalances. Look, this is what we said to the last administration.
Right.
We said, don't impose the tariffs.
Right.
Instead, negotiate a rules-based, enforceable free trade agreement.
Right, okay.
And there was an attempt to do that. It didn't seem to be. I mean, I actually attended the signing ceremony.
Right.
As our friends came over from China with masks, and we're all sitting there
Right.
without them a week before the world shut down. And unfortunately, we haven't really seen any progress from that. So we really need, I mean, this is another example of where we need to have some leadership on the world stage to negotiate free trade agreements. And China is clearly one of those. And by the way, if we're adding other countries, let's talk about the UK, let's talk about Kenya, let's talk about Japan, let's talk about Ukraine, for crying out loud.
Oh, wow. Interesting idea.
Let's get these done, and let's marry them with our foreign policy, and let's support free market economies and democracies. That's the way we do that. And then we negotiate with command economies like China so that we can hold their feet to the fire when it comes to trade practices that, quite frankly, just simply aren't fair.
Great. Thank you for those concluding thoughts. Let me give it to Ken.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Doug. Really appreciate this thoughtful and insightful conversation about trade and America's place in the world. And really grateful to you for all your great work on behalf of so many leading American companies. Thank you for being here with us today. Yep. Everybody who's here, thank you, Jay. We are taking a short break while we get the stage reset for our ambassadors panel. So don't go anywhere, but we will be back just in a few minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Our Ambassadors Roundtable is a tradition at the Washington International Trade Conference, and we're so pleased to welcome here today Ambassador Moctezuma of Mexico, Ambassador Liu of Singapore, Ambassador Crespo Sancho of Costa Rica, Ambassador Neelup Siena, appointed ambassador of the EU to the United States, and our moderator, Ambassador Kristen Silverberg, the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable. Kristen?
Great. Thank you, Ken, and thank you to WIDA for having us here today. This panel, the ambassadors panel, has become a tradition at WIDA, which I am delighted to help continue. I'm particularly excited because the topic we're discussing today, the role of trade in advancing foreign policy, is a critical one for the ongoing debate in the U.S. about our approach to trade agreements. There was a time not too long ago when U.S. administrations would unapologetically tout the national security and foreign policy benefits of trade, but that line of argument has gone out of fashion in parts of Washington. When you hear officials from the Trump or the Biden administrations talking about the connection between national security and trade, they're likely to be talking about the national security risks of trade rather than the ways that trade can be used to advance U.S. foreign policy interests. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to put this issue to some of our closest trading partners to ask them how they think about these connections, how they think about the role of their own trade agreements, including their trade agreements with us. And so let me get started. Ambassador Moctezuma, I want to start with you. And I want to start with this issue of friend shoring. We obviously, lots of people in the U.S. government, lots of U.S. companies are worried about supply chain risk, including, not limited to, but including geopolitical risk. And of course, we have a trade agreement with Mexico that's helping to advance friend shoring. How do you think about this trend, and what do you think we need to do to take full advantage of this opportunity?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine, and I think that we are true believers in trade in Mexico. We just became the partner number one of the U.S. Last year with about $800 billion in trade. And if we are partners number one of the U.S., that means that we have an incredible effort in both countries in order to have this nearshoring trend. Last year also, Mexico received the most important foreign investment, the direct foreign investment in its history. And what is very interesting is that many of the companies that have invested in Mexico, besides nearshoring, they are looking for human capital. If you speak with the people of Tesla, Tesla announced its new factory in Nuevo León. They say that they found out that they would have a source of very well-prepared engineers in Mexico that will work for their factory in Nuevo León, and that was one of the most important aspects to have that investment there. Another thing that I can say is that when Mexico exports, we have 40% of U.S. previous imports. So when Mexico exports, the U.S. is also exporting. And what this shows you is that Mexico and the U.S. are not just trade partners, but that we're producing together. There are many, many, many companies and there are many products that come and go several times in the border, and that they are produced together. So it's not just trade, it's an economic integration.
Wonderful, thank you. Ambassador Crespo Sancho, let me turn to you and ask you about your Costa Rica's trading relationship with the U.S. When President Bush signed CAFTA-DR in 2004, he unapologetically cited the national security or the foreign policy strategic benefits. He talked about the fact that it would impact U.S. influence in the region, that it would promote stability, and so on. I think the economic benefits of the deal have been clear. Our own bilateral trade has really expanded. But do you think that it's also met some of the expectations in terms of strategic benefit? Can you just talk about the broader consequences of CAFTA-DR?
Sure. I want to start with, part of my job is to talk to everyone on the Hill and talk to everyone. And one of the first things that people ask, or when I ask them about Costa Rica, they just think about, a place to go to visit, most of the pineapples that you get here and bananas also, but pineapples are from Costa Rica. And when I tell them, actually our number one export are medical devices, people think like, what do you mean? Oh, I didn't know Costa Rica did that. And I'm like, oh yes, we do. We have one, and it is, CAFTA has been a success story for Costa Rica. Not only medical devices, that's just an example, because also semiconductors and many other things. Let's start with Costa Rica, even before CAFTA, has had very strong friendship, working relationships with the United States. But CAFTA-DR actually helped expand those relationships, not only with the United States, but also within Central America and Dominican Republic, which is a big plus. We do have two vibrant sectors. Again, I have mentioned them already, the medical devices, which are also close to national security of the United States, and semiconductors. I can even tell you that Intel last year, in August, they announced a $1.2 billion investment in the next 2 years in Costa Rica, and that little teeny tiny country that people just think about going to travel, which is also great. Please go. It's a 4.5-hour flight from here. But again, what are the challenges that we're having? This is, about 20 years ago. What are the challenges today is that there's political challenges within the Central American region that probably makes CAFTA, although it's still very beneficial for all the countries, including Costa Rica, which is why Costa Rica is trying to open up to get, why don't we start looking into other options? So let me give you a little bit of an insight of how slow we are. I don't know if you've heard the saying in Costa Rica, pura vida, that everything is pure life, like, oh yeah. So we're slow, but we get there. What do I mean with that? Because you can get slow and not do or not get to where you need to go. We decided to be part of OECD, the highest standards, some of the highest standards in the world. It took us 10 years. When we first started, which actually the Minister of Trade, the current Minister of Trade, was part of that. they said, no, you guys are crazy. Costa Rica has to go through a lot of, Congress, changes in laws, regulations. 10 years later, we did it. As of 2 years, we're part of OECD countries. So that means that Costa Rica can even join, let's say, USMCA. Why not? USMCA has pretty good high standards. Costa Rica can get to those standards. So CAFTA-DR prepared us for that, which is, again, that doesn't mean that if we start with other trade agreements, that doesn't mean that we're going to leave one behind. But it's going to, if we can give more and we can have higher standards, if a country can do that, why not?
Thank you. Ambassador Lee, let me ask you about Singapore's trade agenda. While the U.S. has moved away from negotiating traditional trade agreements, Singapore has charged ahead. You've now implemented 27 FTAs. Within Singapore, do you think of those as just part of your economic agenda, or do you also think about them as part of a foreign policy tool?
Well, I would start off by saying that trade is 3 times the GDP in Singapore. So you obviously know the position that I would take. And I believe in the rules-based multilateral trading system, how it was forged by the US coming out of World War II and has over the decades contributed, I think, immensely to international stability, economic growth, allowing countries large and small to reap efficiencies of scale, productivity, dividends from innovation, and so on. I think in our part of the world, we have seen how trade has fueled domestic development, but also regional, even global integration amongst economies. When we talk about foreign policy, domestic support for foreign policy is really important. And that's so for every country. And I think trade has, for a number of decades, been one of those areas where you can see concrete results arising from the foreign relations, from the agreements that we signed. And certainly the benefits in the early decades of globalization may have masked some of the problems that we see today, the distributive inequalities and inefficiencies arising from globalization that all societies have to tackle. But nonetheless, I think if you take it in its totality, the multilateral rules-based trading system has been a plus for almost all countries. Maybe a little bit about Singapore and the US, because this year we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the free trade agreement between our two countries, first established in 2004. And if I take it to the latest year when we have good trade data, 2022, over those 18 years, actually trade between our two countries has grown 3 times, from about 70 billion at its inception to now about 210 billion US dollars. By the way, the US enjoys a very healthy surplus of Singapore, which may come in useful next year depending on how things shape up. And the US runs a surplus, both in trade in goods as well as a trade in services. So it's not one masking the other. But also as a result of the free trade agreement, we have close to 6,000 US companies in Singapore, using us as a regional headquarters for some of them, but Singapore as a springboard to the larger region and reaping the benefits of the integration that we see in ASEAN and across larger Asian economies. Investments from US into Singapore, just to give you a sense of what it is like, cumulative FDI over the years, is close to about $500 billion US dollars, right? What does that mean? It means that the cumulative stock of US FDI in Singapore is larger than the US FDI into China, Japan, and South Korea combined, okay? And so when I say that actually there's a lot of economic skin in the game for US to remain deeply vested in our part of the world, I think you'll understand what it is that I'm saying.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Nalupshine, can you have a foreign policy background from Lithuania. What are your reflections on this broad question of the role of trade in advancing foreign policy?
Well, thank you for the question. And I would like to pick where the president of the Manufacturers Association actually left, because his last statement was extremely, I think, to the point, saying that if we want to advance, or if we want to move together with our trade and make sure that our foreign policy agenda or our security agenda moves in the same vein or in parallel, we have to do those two together. Mm-hmm. And because, well, we probably, there is between the transatlantic, in the transatlantic relations, one of the things is values. It's a value-based partnership. First of all, we were the ones who together built international rules and order and international organizations, and I think that we probably have to appreciate more how it works, because, well, the trade probably, as we see right now in the modern age, would not be the same if we don't have those international rules and the organizations associated there. My colleague was talking about OECD, but you know there are standards of WTO which we have to adhere, and multiple, many more. And if we look at the geopolitics, what is happening right now in the world, I think it's getting scarier with each day. The turbulences, the conflicts around the world actually has a huge implication on our economy. On one hand, it's definitely challenges, you know, the prices, inflation, distorted supply chains, anything you want. But on the other hand, when you have reliable trading partners, if you have really a strong and resilient transatlantic relation, you can see that even during the crisis, the most severe crisis, you actually see the trade growing. So if last year we had 1.3 trillion euros between EU and US 2 years ago. So last year will be almost 5% higher. You know, slowly but steadily growing up. And one of the reasons was that in Europe we had to make a huge change in the energy sector, because European over-reliance on Russian energy resources had to be solved as the issue. And don't underestimate how much it costs in organizing that, making sure that you don't freeze and your people don't freeze during the winter, the last one. And on top of that, you have to find where to buy new resources, and here comes where alliances matters. Most of the the growth of the trade is actually due to that EU buys a lot of LNG. It's and when you need to switch fast, if you need to change more than 60% of your energy resources, you have to pay the price, and you have to rely on your allies. And I think this actually is supposed to speak for itself. And we can go, sector by sector. Semiconductors had been mentioned. We can go into the connectivity sector and think, if you want to find alternatives, or if you want to have a reliable, secure production line, I think you will always depend on your most on the partners of Secretary Blinken called on the partners of the first resort.
Let me stay with you. So the U.S. and Europe have a history of using our combined economic influence to work together to address national security risks and foreign policy objectives, sometimes using trade tools in cooperation with each other. Do you think we're in lockstep on China? And if not, where do you see differences?
Well, I think that the biggest difference is probably more rhetorical than on the paper and in reality. First of all, of course, EU approaches China as a trading partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. And I think that you can use different words or different synonyms, and you will find that actually a U.S. approach is not very much different. Your head of national security advisor spoke about their small backyards, high walls or high fences. We as well have just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of January, you produced an economic security strategy, which actually in general includes 4 major sectors which we want to de-risk with China, be it semiconductors, high power computing, quantum computing, biotech, so AI. So I don't, even in the sector-wise, we are actually quite close. And of course, this includes making sure, dual-use goods are not going, so export control, strengthening investment screening, starting discussions on the outbound in investments, how we see in certain sectors, and even going small, but I think very important step further, which I'm sure in this country we will have to witness as well. Actually, looking into what we do as a research projects and in science, because science and the research can be as well quite sensitive and dual use. So this is these are approaches which I think. It's really quite close, and we have actually a format, TTC, Trade and Technology Council, between EU and US, where we definitely have a possibility to discuss and to compare, not only to discuss, but actually to compare our notes.
Ambassador Lui, you served in China. Anything you want to add about Singapore's approach to China or cooperation with the US on these issues?
Well, I think Singapore, as a small country, obviously would want to be friend with all countries, near and far, big and small. We're mindful of the sensitivities in the US-China relationship, especially over trade and investments in sensitive areas. I think the world has gone from one where the operating paradigm was interdependence to one where we are acutely mindful of overdependence, right? And hence now you're really trying to untangle some of that interdependence to try and find ways to make your supply chains, your trade relations more robust. And that's understandable. Today, it is more focusing on a particular country and whether, for example, the US may be over-reliant on that country. I suspect that in time to come, it wouldn't just be focusing on countries, but companies from that country, whether it is operating within that country or outside of that country. And so you will have secondary order effects that will have to be studied further in the years to come. Singapore is a hub for investments around the world. Significant part of it comes from the US, as I already mentioned, but Japan, from the EU, and a growing number of Chinese companies are also coming into Singapore. And so Singapore will have to be mindful of some of these sensitivities and to be able to tread the needle very, very carefully. We still believe that we can be a place where there's cross-pollination of ideas and people, but increasingly we must also guard against cross-pollution. And in areas where commingling should not take place, then it is very important, I think, for Singapore to to ensure that there are safeguards in place where that commingling is going to be as separate as we can make it.
Wonderful thing. Ambassador Moctezuma, we are coming up on the sunset review of USMCA in 2026, and the parties have already begun conversations around that. Jay Timmons was just saying that the U.S. has some issues, and Mexico has issues, and Canada has a few issues. I expect some of these issues around national security will be part of that conversation. How do you see the sunset review playing out, and can you just highlight some of the key themes?
Well, I think that USMCA is a success story. The three countries can tell you that. And what I believe is that we have to stop looking at the trees and start looking at the forest, which is the future of the U.S. and the future of the region. I'm going to give you just an example. If you look at the production and of transportation equipment, if we see manufacturing in the world, China produces 9.8% of the world's transportation equipment, which means planes and trains and ships and everything. The U.S. produces 7.6%. So China already passed the production and the manufacturing capacities of the U.S. But if you sum up Mexico, which produces 6.4%, and Canada, 2.9%, then you have 16.9%. So when North America produces 16.9%, that's much more than 9.8%. So what we should be thinking is about the medium and long-term view of where do we want to get as a region, as the North American region. I think that we're giving very strong steps toward that future with the Chips and Science Act and with the Anti-Inflationary Act, when they are giving credit, fiscal credits to products that are produced in North America. Because I think that the North American region has to be seen as a unit, and that means that, as you said, foreign policy and trade must be looked not together but as one common effort. And what I'm really optimistic about is that I believe that shared values and the fight for freedom and democracy in the world will be led by North America, which I'm sure it will become the most competitive and humanistic region in the world.
Wonderful. And I know you're here in D.C. watching our presidential campaign play out very closely. And of course, we're watching your presidential campaign play out. Are trade issues a big part of your presidential campaign? And if so, what are the issues in debate in Mexico?
In Mexico, campaigns have not officially started. There are candidates, and the two main forces have a woman as candidate, so we will have a woman president for the first time in history. But campaigns have not started. And of course, trade is a very, very important issue. We trade with the U.S. About 70% of our trade. And from our GDP, 80% is manufacturing and trade. So it's very, very important for us.
Yes, wonderful. Ambassador Crispa-Sancho, one of the interesting approaches the Biden administration has taken is to, instead of negotiating traditional binding trade agreements, they're pursuing these novel trade frameworks in both the Indo-Pacific and in our region. Can you just talk about that approach? What are your sort of main ambitions for the Americas partnership, and what do you think is possible using this kind of novel framework?
Interestingly enough, Costa Rica will be hosting next year the meeting 2025 in the APEC meeting. And also, President Chavez accepted a leader, he's going to take on a leadership role within APEC. And also there is a possibility where they're discussing about which other countries are going to be part of APEC. So we're not the only countries that are in right now, but there are other countries there's a possibility that them joining. So there's a lot of interesting things happening with APEC. And the last meeting was November. So that November, many of the presidents of the region were here. They were discussing what are the next steps. Costa Rica has two main kind of sectors. One is the commerce and trade, and the other one is more kind of the foreign relations. And those are the two tracks that we're kind of joining, or that we're leading per se. We're also leading the one on the Center for Excellence, which is related to CHIPS Act money. So ITSE funds is also related to that. And Costa Rica is going to be hosting, every country will have its own responsibility, but Costa Rica is hosting the Center for Excellence related to technology for a regional Center for Excellence, which, as you all know, probably, we do not have, even the United States, and I think that's also a problem worldwide, that there are not sufficient people with the necessary skills for technology jobs. So I think the last numbers, and if I'm not mistaken, there's about a lack of 300,000 people in Latin America with those skills. So that regional hub, which is already moving into Costa Rica, and the government is taking it on. Intel is helping us already. They're giving us a chunk of money to make a virtual lab. And there's going to be a cloud lab. There's going to be 3 overall labs within Costa Rica. So the people in Latin America, from Mexico, from Argentina, from everywhere, can go there, train, and help the region overall. Because in the US, there's also a lack of skills. So we're all having those same issues. So that is what, let's say, Costa Rica is doing with APEP. However, we also have, we see APEP as a great opportunity when things are not as open as we wish they were in issues related to trade. Then we have to look for other venues. And I think APEP is a good other venue to start with. So we'll have to see how it evolves and how it actually, we want to see results. That's what Costa Rica is trying to, and I think all the other countries, members of APEP, that's what we're looking for, results.
Wonderful. I have one final question for Ambassador Lui, and then I want to take some time to open it up to the audience. But I did want to get to digital trade, Singapore's the role that Singapore is playing in that. Your FTA with Chile and New Zealand has become a standard for digital trade agreements. Can you just talk for a minute about the future of digital trade as you see it?
Maybe if you permit me to take a step back to talk actually about the new economic architecture that is being envisioned in our part of the world in the Indo-Pacific. You have the CPTPP, all of you are familiar with it. The US is not present. China is knocking on the doors and hoping to be admitted. You have the RCEP that was initiated by ASEAN to bring together our main dialogue partners in Asia. And so we have China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The US is not in it. We've got the DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that you just mentioned, initiated by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. South Korea is on the verge of being admitted. China is knocking on the doors, so too Canada and Costa Rica. The US is not in it. There is a danger that the US is absent from all the economic architectures that is being developed in our part of the world. And if you then look ahead 20, 30 years down the road, what does that portend for US relations with Asia and with the Indo-Pacific? Which is why Singapore so deeply invested in IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Not because we see huge benefits for us economically, because we already have bilateral free trade agreements with almost everybody, but because we believe that the US cannot afford to be absent economically from our part of the world. To your point, digital economy partnership agreements, we believe that clean economy agreements, DPAs, going to be the way forward. So there is that trilateral with New Zealand, with Chile. We've got bilaterals with the UK, with Australia, with South Korea. We've got a clean economy agreement with Australia. We believe that there are going to be benefits for some of these new agreements, particularly when it pertains to SMEs, right, which is obviously also a cause for some interest and concern within the United States. And we believe that we need to work together on establishing the rules, the standards, and when necessary, even the safeguards to make sure that digital economy transactions and integration can take place in a structured, rules-based manner going forward.
Great, thank you, and very compelling points about the importance of U.S. engagement in the region. So I want to ask the audience to come in now with any questions. I see a question here on the front table.
Hi, I'm Barbara Simmons. I'm Vice Chair of the International Law Section for the National Bar. We are in talks with the African Continental Free Trade Area to enter into an MOU, and I was pleased to see that Ambassador Tai has signed, the U.S. has signed an agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area. My question for the ambassadors is, what do you see as your short and long-term relationship with Africa, acknowledging that it is a continent, not a country, in terms of trade and how that serves as a foreign policy approach?
Ambassador Nalupshane, you want to take that one?
Well, thank you for the question. It's not really the secret that EU considers Africa as the neighbor, not neighborhood, but neighbor. And the relations are really for quite some time has been very stable. But of course, we are talking about continent, so there are security issues, questions about democracy and rule of law. But EU is the biggest contributor for the international partnership. And in other words, development. And I think that actually really paves the way for the bigger trade or more broader trade relations. There is another huge project which actually EU is changing the mindset and moving on is the Global Gateway, the huge project which supposed to encourage partnerships, not only government to government, but as well private business and financial institutions, to partnership in the huge infrastructural, first of all, projects, which may then pave the way for the really more favorable trade and commerce relations. So I think that if it works, we would be in the absolutely different future of our commercial relations in 3 to 5 years.
Wonderful. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Doug Palmer with Politico. This is for the Mexican ambassador. Actually, I had gotten an email just the other day from a reader asking me if I'd heard about a rumor that the Mexican government was going to put forward an executive order to increase tariffs. And I hadn't heard about it, but here I am today, and I thought I would take the opportunity to ask you, is there some new Mexican government tariff action coming down the pike?
Not that I know.
I think we've got one.
Yes, here we go.
Thank Thank you. Hi, I'm Khushbu from the South China Morning Post. I have two questions. We talked about elections and we talked about tariffs. I just wanted to ask you, when former President Donald Trump was a Republican favorite to get the nomination, when he says, I'll put 10% tariffs, 60% tariffs, NATO is not an ally, how do you view that? Is there nervousness? Are you already thinking about how you're going to deal with the tariffs if they come into place? And how tariffs like those actually impact what we're talking about, trade as foreign policy? And I have a specific question for Ambassador from Singapore. You talked about Chinese companies coming to Singapore. And recently we saw, one of those companies is TikTok, and we recently saw the CEO of TikTok being grilled. Some of the questions that were being asked were, some of the Singaporeans thought that were racist. How does, a grilling like that, some questions like that impact what we're talking about, trade as, foreign policy, if someone from Singapore is repeatedly asked if he works for the Chinese Communist Party? Thank you.
Do you want to take the 10% impact of 10% tariffs first? I thought you got off easy with Doug's question. So what is the impact of a 10%?
Well, that would be
across the board.
That would be very, very. It will hinder the whole relationship because it's against free trade, and it's against the North American region. Mm-hmm. What I truly believe is that the future of Mexico, Canada, and the United States is to become allies and to really work together in a much higher view about the world's development. Because we're not just sharing goods and services, we're sharing also values. And when you start taking down the foundations of free trade, which is the one that put us in this condition to work together, I think that's not a very good idea.
Yeah. Anything to add on the TikTok?
We know Senator Cotton well. He's visited Singapore. We hold him in high regard. I think we've also got to see the line of questioning that he took and the remarks that he made subsequently from two angles. One, of course, this is election season, and they've got a domestic audience that they need to be able to not only understand the concerns and sensitivities, but also to find ways to address them, right? So that's one part of it. Two, I think it reflects some of the deep-seated concerns that the US may have over its trade relations with China, over companies in China, whether in China itself or coming out of China, that would hold a significant amount of data, possibly even sensitive data of US citizens. So there is a certain, I would say, something that can be understood, something that can be appreciated. I think, though, a line of question taken too far can sometimes possibly undermine the image and standing of how the US is viewed in different parts of the world, not just in Asia and not necessarily only in Singapore. So there's, I think, a fine balance that needs to be struck between some of the security sensitivities and also the overall image and impression that the US would want to continue to project and portray to the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Venia Chen. I'm at Georgetown Law. I have a question for Ambassador Lui as well from Singapore. You were listing the free trade agreements of the region in Asia right now, and you were saying how the US is not a part of it or not even knocking on the door, whereas China is. And I was wondering, it seems like China wants to get in, right? So this position of what kind of compromises or what kind of concessions are the other countries that are already part of these agreements asking from China, or is there a position where you can ask for something what kind of concessions, and can maybe the U.S. or other regions learn from that or use that as well?
Well, I would say that I'm obviously not privy to the discussions that are taking place. There's a session working group started for China, as indeed for Canada, on the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And the one for China is chaired by Chile. We haven't gone to that stage yet for CPTPP. But across both of these agreements is the need for consensus by all current members to accept a new member. And that consensus will build on top of, number one, an assurance that an applicant can fully meet the standards. And number two, that the members are convinced that the applicant will faithfully abide by the commitments that it signs up to. So we believe that those are standards that we will not compromise on, and how the discussions with any particular applicant will shape up, I think it's for the working groups to deal with.
Great, thank you. Well, in the panel just before us, Jay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I
sorry,
just,
yes.
just one sentence is it's very good, of course, to have a regional agreements, especially having in mind the topics which goes much beyond any single continent, like e-commerce or digital trade. But I do believe we have really to be sure, as the like-minded countries here and as they're sharing the same values, that the most important format for arranging the global agreements and having a global format is actually WTO. If we don't manage to do all of us, then it should be multilateral. And I think that everyone has to be on board. And I think that if there are like-minded countries can set standards for that, we will be all better off than regionalizing ourselves. And hopefully, U.S. will actively join on that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to give you the last word. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Ken, for having us.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, ambassadors.
Thank you.
Really great note for us to end this panel on, with a directive for us all to work together. We talked about that. Our opening session yesterday was with Angela Ellard, the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, talking about the upcoming MC13. I know we're all looking forward to that. So thank you all very much for joining us. For those of you in the room, I'd like to welcome you to go get lunch. If you can smell it already, we can already smell it here in the room. It's a buffet lunch. We're going to bring it back in here, and we're having a little break, and then at about 12:15 p.m., we're going to restart for our last session of the conference with Congressman Adrian Smith, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Thank you all. Thank you, ambassadors, and we'll see you back up here in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody, for your patience with us. I'd now like to welcome to the stage Congressman Adrian Smith with Stephanie Lester of Gap Inc. I hope everyone enjoyed your lunch. Thank you so much for joining us here today and sticking with us for the closing session of the 2024 Washington International Trade Conference. We're delighted to welcome our final speaker on stage. He's a good friend of all of us in the trade community, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, Congressman Adrian Smith of Nebraska's 3rd Congressional District, which I'm told is about 65,000 square miles. It's one of the largest non-at-large districts in the country, bigger than 26 states, if my math is correct. Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us, and Stephanie, who's the vice president of WIDA's board of directors. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here with you, Chairman Smith. A little bit more about you, some fun facts. It's not only large geographically, but your district is the #1 agriculture producing district by market value, right?
Right.
So you've got a
and
lot
a few
of
other
interest
things too.
in agriculture. Well, you're a big Nebraska volleyball fan.
That's right. That's big in Nebraska.
I hear. Folks may remember last year the Nebraska women's volleyball team set a world record pulling 92,000 fans to a game, which that would make Taylor Swift proud.
In the football stadium.
Yeah, in the football stadium. That's quite something. You're a co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Agriculture Trade Caucus, and we all know trade is very important to farmers. So let's dig right in. And I'm going to start with the Constitution and the constitutional underpinnings of trade, with the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, giving Congress the authority to regulate tariffs and foreign commerce. But where is Congress going to go? What is the role of Congress? TPA expired in 2015, or it was last renewed in 2015, expired in 2021.
Generations ago.
Feels like generations ago. So what do you think the role of Congress should be in policymaking, understanding that constitutional underpinning?
Look, trade obviously requires the vote of Congress, but it also necessitates the leadership of the administration. And this is, I think, a great example of tag teaming that can take place to achieve a common goal. Obviously, the legislative branch, there can be gridlock and various things, and yet now would be such a great opportunity for the administration to stand up and be heard, for example, on biotech corn and in Mexico, for example. I guess they're going through the process here for enforcement, but I would like to see a stronger position from the administration because Congress did our work. Please remember that USMCA was a Trump priority under a Pelosi speakership. It got done. A great example, and I think can give us some opportunity moving forward.
Yeah. Well, on that, I think we've seen both the Trump and Biden administrations have claimed authority to negotiate agreements without TPA. We had with Trump the Japan Phase 1 agreement. We've got Biden pursuing IPEF and APEP, critical minerals. They've also imposed and maintained some significant tariffs under authorities delegated by Congress. These delegations date back to the 60s and the 70s. Do you think that they've gone too far? And how do we get that back and forth that you were talking about, co-creation?
Right. Well, recently, as you know, the critical mineral agreement that the Biden administration established, that you'll hear Democrats raise their concerns that the administration went too far on that. I think we should always expect an administration to go as far as they possibly can, perhaps they can get away with. But to ignore Congress is to also ignore opportunities to expand trade and to find trade that has enforcement along with it. IPEF, of course, it's been scaled back considerably. It's such a light touch approach. I don't think you'll find too many folks saying, well, the administration went too far because there's just not a lot there. So, but enforcement, and I think this is a bipartisan dynamic, enforcement to any trade agreement is vital. That if there are discussions that take place around trade, that's fine. But unless it contains enforcement, it just won't be as strong. And at the same time, for my colleagues concerned, and there are many, concerned about labor and environment on both sides of the aisle, that level playing field that we seek, the best way to achieve that is through a trade agreement and having these discussions, ironing out the differences, and the best way to get other countries to elevate their labor and environment policies to be closer to us is to say, hey, here's how we can go about that after a good, thorough conversation and then ultimately winding its way through a process such as a trade agreement.
Yeah. You mentioned there isn't much there with IPEF. Is there any effort to maybe change that dynamic to get some more there?
Well, there is an effort. I sense that, the workforce shortages across our economy have recently impacted USTR as well. So the fact is, we just don't see the priority from the administration, which is unfortunate because I did have some hope that there would be some, a stronger posture of really leaning into various trade policies that we know these problems exist. And it's not just Mexico and biotech corn, for example. That one happens to be important to my district. And I will say that if we push that aside or do not aggressively defend ourselves on that, I think we should expect other countries on many fronts to really undermine what has previously been agreed upon. And when you look at agriculture and USMCA, the main difference between NAFTA and USMCA is biotechnology. And here we are. And I think it could have and should have been resolved long before now. But let's not sit back and just watch to see what happens. We need to be aggressive, and hopefully the president will step up and say himself that what's happening is not right.
Yeah. I mentioned the tariffs that were imposed under President Trump and then maintained with Biden, and now we're in an election year, and heard suggestions of maybe 60% tariffs on China in addition, and 10% across the board, tariff increase. Do you think Congress should rethink these authorities that they've delegated to the administration? Look at 232s or 301s or the IEPA delegation. Do you think is there any appetite to revisit some of those?
I think it would be hard to revisit those right now, but it's no secret that I'm not a huge fan of tariffs. I will also say that with any good negotiation, you want all your tools available. Have every tool on the table. And that, should they be used, it should be done in a nimble fashion. To send the message that we're serious about leveling this playing field. I think we definitely want to always keep in mind what is the net impact on consumers. After all, they're the ones that make up our economy. And I heard someone say one time that it's not government that creates jobs, it's not even employers who create jobs, it's customers who create jobs. Here we are.
As a brand, we're working for a brand. I can relate to that sentiment very much. I'm curious, it feels, trade policy feels very stuck and polarized. How are members of Congress just looking at trade policy as trade subcommittee chair? They're coming to you and talking to you. How do we talk about trade in our district? I imagine for you, having such an agricultural district, farmers, it's top of mind for them. Just curious, what are the kind of behind the scenes conversations that lawmakers are asking of you?
Well, colleagues, they generally come to me with a concern about the supply chain and maybe cost of inputs. So I hear a lot about that. Back home in the district, I will say that in terms of agriculture, President Trump enjoyed a lot of support, even amidst some of the retaliation that had taken place, because I think they sensed that there was a strong position coming from Washington and the White House at the time on leveling the playing field. And so leaning into those issues and trade writ large, I think really empowered folks to ultimately come together, finish up with USMCA, and provide a framework. I mean, USMCA, I think, at least best to my knowledge, is the most bipartisan trade agreement in modern history. And so that, I think, was an opportunity to kick off and a precursor to other opportunities around the world that has not been seized of late.
Yeah, that raises a good question, because you did see, while they both have imposed tariffs, you had Trump really take on USMCA and the Japan agreement. How would you compare the two administrations and their trade policies and their trade records?
Oh, well, we're still waiting to hear what the analysis is on some of the tariffs, which we should have heard before now, I would argue. But not even looking at the outcomes of, say, the 4 years of the Trump administration and so far the 3 years of Biden. But it's hard to say that trade in the last 3 years is even close to a priority. And as much hope as I had when our trade ambassador was introduced on a bipartisan basis before the Senate panel in the confirmation process. And so, and I don't know what all has led to such inactivity coming from the administration as it relates to trade, but it's glaring. And this all amidst supply chain crisis, inflation. If ever there's a time that we need to really lean into trade, it's right now, and has been this way for some time. And the line is, well, they fear they don't have the votes for a trade agreement. Well, I don't know of any trade agreement that started out with enough votes. It required a great amount of diligence, conversation, interactions, both branches, executive and legislative branch of the government. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, trade is not easy. It's very difficult. It's very complex. It gets in the weeds really quickly. But to just ignore it will not cause the problems to go away. Engagement is what is necessary. And, domestic manufacturers, for example, they are begging for stronger supply chains and various other dynamics that we need to pay attention to. And we're just not seeing it, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Hear you on the inaction. There are, I think, I'm an optimist, and I would like to, I'm excited at the prospect of Ways and Means kind of digging in on trade, hopefully in the near term, and I think this is what everybody wants to hear about, the Ways and Means trade agenda. So let's go there. And there's some pending legislation that is the role of Congress to renew things like the generalized system of preferences, which I personally think is a dereliction of duty that it's been expired for as long as it has. Right. But also the miscellaneous tariff bill, AGOA, Haiti, all these things are coming up for renewal in our legislative programs. What do you expect to come up in committee in the coming weeks and months?
Sure, but I think you can look for legislation coming up on GSP and MTB. I've been really interacting with colleagues, and some good dialogue there that I think can help us arrive at some text to move some things forward. I think overall, we just had a hearing last week, Trade Subcommittee about the WTO heading into their next ministerial. Very bipartisan in our concerns, whether it's the TRIPS waiver and what that means moving forward. But 3 years with more than 3 years now with GSP and MTB lapsed, that obviously has folks concerned. When they're thinking about AGOA coming up next year for renewal. And, that sends signals. This 3-year lapse sends signals in other directions that we should be concerned about. So now I think we're making good progress and able to bring folks together on this. It's unfortunate, though, that it has taken so long.
Do you expect that work to be bipartisan?
I do. I do believe the work will be bipartisan, and domestic manufacturing, for example, that's begging for these provisions, it's bipartisan. It is not. These companies across America aren't just in Republican districts, for example, or just Democratic districts. It's all very bipartisan. And I think the fact that USMCA was so bipartisan has really elevated the interests of both sides of the aisle. And so let's use that to moving forward to move the ball down the field.
There's also a lot of attention on China among policymakers, and the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, they've been quite vocal and active, including making recommendations on China trade issues, raising questions about PNTR, policies like de minimis, and these are squarely within the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee. So how do you think the committee is going to deal with some of these things that the China committee has raised in their recommendations?
Yeah, well, with any select committee creation, that can sometimes concern the standing committees and the jurisdiction associated. But I think overall, though, there's been good conversation between the Select Committee on China, the Ways and Means Committee, other committees as well. And I appreciate their diligence. I think that the bipartisan nature and priority of being bipartisan has been especially helpful. I will also say, looking back to last spring, when the president of Taiwan came to California, to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, that was a bipartisan presence for us to welcome the president of Taiwan, and I think that helped us get some other things done moving forward from there. Now, when it comes to supply chains and what China happens to be doing right now, that concerns me a lot. That perhaps there were some unintended consequences, but our response, we need to be careful of unintended consequences as well. That we might take some action and not even come close to achieving what was intended. In fact, off to the side, there might be even worse consequences. So we have to be careful of that. The economy, the way it moves, isn't always easy to predict, and we have to, I think, be diligent in how we fashion our policy. Again, keeping consumers in mind, but to also realize that our supply chain resiliency can take form in different ways, and GSP, MTB, for example, it's not just about China, and it's about other friendly countries who share many of our values, perhaps not 100% aligned. We need to be mindful of that as well, but to develop, as the terms go, friendshoring and nearshoring, fantastic opportunities, I think, along the way, whether it's Central America, South America, others. I don't want to get too geographically specific, but a fact of the matter is, I think there are options in the world that exist in a very vibrant way that, again, leaning into trade policy could deliver better results than what we've seen. That I think at the beginning, a while back, I would have characterized the posture on trade coming from the White House as just treading water. But I don't even think it's that good these days. And that inactivity, that inaction from the administration that many Democrats tell me off to the side that they're concerned about as well, that we are losing opportunities. And that's with our own interests in mind, and as well as the broader geopolitical interests as well.
Mm-hmm. Losing opportunities takes me back to farmers, and they are so in touch with trade and so reliant on trade. Are they asking you to find new ways to open market access, and how do we get there in a bipartisan way? It just feels very stuck.
Right now, that calling it stuck, that is correct. I think U.S. agriculture, they're very engaged on trade. They understand. Whether it's TPA, whether it's other, promotion of our products abroad. I wish that more of the American people could understand, say, the Foreign Ag Service and what exists on our behalf in embassies around the world. And it's very impressive, and so we want to keep them on task and to keep advocating for our products around the world. So they're I think, good examples of this, and we don't want to forget about that. In fact, I was in Japan a few years back, and hearing our Foreign Ag Service officer there talk about U.S. beef, and I am a little partial, but an expert on the ground in a country like Japan, where it is absolutely vital, these are things that take place that we should really celebrate. And I think agriculture is very engaged on this, to your question. But we can't take anything for granted. And other countries, they would love to take the market share that we might take for granted from time to time. Now, I happen to think that our beef tastes better than perhaps some other type of beef from other countries. And fortunately, I think consumers around the world share this view. But if our products are so much more expensive, consumers, whether it's here, whether it's there, they're ultimately in charge. And they're going to be price sensitive as well.
I imagine you have a strong opinion, corn-fed or grass-fed?
There's no question.
Corn-fed, okay.
Japan likes to tell me that they like to buy our corn even to feed their beef. So the fact of the matter is, Japan and the U.S. are fierce competitors in many ways, healthy competitors, I will say. And when it comes to beef, they've got their products, we've got our products, and both valuable in different ways. And that back and forth has been very healthy, and has given more opportunity for their products, for our products, and it really elevates the entire situation. And so I don't hear from beef producers in my district saying, well, shut out the Japanese Kobe or Wagyu beef. There's room in the world for both of our products. And I think that's just one example of how healthy competition ultimately helps consumers.
Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning, you're co-chair of the Congressional Agriculture Trade Caucus. You've got a strong cast of co-chairs with Dusty Johnson and Jimmy Panetta and Jim Costa. What do you hope to achieve with that caucus?
Well, we just launched that a couple of weeks ago, and appreciate, that it's both Ways and Means and Ag Committee and others. That there's such keen interest in this that ag, we've got a great story to tell on trade, and having this ag trade caucus helps elevate that exposure to what has happened previously. Let's always remember how we've gotten to the place where we are, and how we can leverage our position now for greater opportunities moving forward. So that's what this is about. And to just bring more information to colleagues and ultimately folks who are interested across America and around the world, that agriculture, it doesn't happen by accident that we have record yields amidst a drought. And that's not just the research that takes place. That isn't as valuable unless producers across Ag America are willing to engage new ideas, new ways of doing things. And if we're not careful, and we don't have expanding markets overseas, we just have our producers become victims of their own success in terms of efficient production. And I think it is an incredible opportunity that we can help feed the world. And I think we should take this very seriously, and that when you look at the developments, there is absolutely so much to celebrate and highlight.
Great. Well, I don't want to monopolize all the questions. I imagine that the audience has some burning questions. So if, Doug, I'm looking right at you. So.
Well, thanks. Congressman Smith, I just wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on the prospects for legislation. You sounded fairly optimistic of stuff moving. I mean, do you see a package of trade legislation getting through the House and the Senate all the way to the president's desk? And what would you think would be in that? Would it include GSP, miscellaneous tariff bill, or I don't know what else, TAA or AGOA renewal? Just if you could be a little more
Yeah, I think the hearing from colleagues and so forth that GSP has a lot of momentum, but MTB certainly is still important as well. So hard to say exactly, even with legislation to be introduced, what that final product looks like. But there's bipartisan interest here, and and especially the signals that we can send, say, GSB, MTB, on to teeing up hopefully a GOA renewal before it expires, so that we can prevent any lapsed time that would otherwise take place.
Thanks. I had a question on de minimis, which Stephanie mentioned. There are a lot of proposals swirling around on that to reduce the de minimis level, or even eliminate de minimis entirely, exclude certain countries for geopolitical reasons, exclude certain products, to deal with particular protected industries, to ensure CBP gets sufficient information. What are your thoughts on that, and what you're hearing from members, how you navigate that while maintaining, the underlying policy behind having a de minimis provision?
Right. I think a common thread with those who express concern to me, and for good reason, is enforcement. So, just hypothetically, if de minimis were gotten rid of and there were no enforcement, would anything change? And then, the tighter that might be, the more difficult enforcement can become. Now, keep in mind that, various countries, just take, with Canada, there's such a glaring difference between our de minimis and their de minimis because they are so protectionist in their approach. Now, ultimately, I think that hurts their own consumers. But as we move forward, looking at de minimis the way it is now, and there's a variety of opinions there. And my first message is, okay, how can we accomplish whatever someone is setting out to accomplish? And we have to be, I think, very thoughtful in this approach, because I think we've arrived at a scenario, commercially looking, just anecdotally, that some of these things were not intended with increasing de minimis the way it was, or the way it has been. And so moving forward, let's have as much information on the table as possible, so that we can sort through what is it that folks really want to achieve, and how and what is the best way to go about achieving that. So we have to be diligent and careful there.
Congressman, good to see you again. I have a question on enforcement. You mentioned that's a priority, and of course it is for all private sectors. Mexican private sector is not the exception. But as you know, the record of the USMCA on enforcement, putting aside labor, is not pretty good. So my question is if we can expect that there's a window of opportunity to change this trend once the elections are over. You have your election, we have ours this year. And we will very soon get, after the elections, into the review clause. The implementing bill indicates that October 25, that process will start. So do you see that there's a window of opportunity building on the bipartisanship of the USMCA to work on getting to the review clause with a better record on enforcement? I don't know, maybe the recently created Caucus on ACT could take the lead on that, but is there something that could be done there?
The short answer, yes. I think there is a window of opportunity. Obviously, with our presidential election coming up, that provides limited opportunity, I think, for policy yet this year. But I think soon after the election, there's reasons, that you mentioned as well, that point to, hey, let's get this worked out, so that both sides can move forward in a way where it's understandable, and that various stakeholders see on the horizon a more level playing field.
Congressman, my name is Kate Kalukowicz. I'm with McClarty Associates. Thank you so much for taking the time. In particular, I really liked what you said about the consumer and the customer really driving the way we think about trade. And perhaps one of the most direct way for companies in America, particularly small and medium-sized companies, to reach new customers is through the internet. And we haven't spoken much about digital trade. But I'm very interested in your perspective on this because, of course, you talked about USTR and the administration treading water, but in many ways in digital, we're actually seeing the backstroke. Because, of course, USMCA had some really novel commitments when it came to digital trade and e-commerce, and regrettably, we're seeing the administration moving away from some of those long-held positions with free flow of data and free competition for U.S. companies overseas. So I'd be very interested in your perspective of what the subcommittee, or even more broadly, the Ways and Means Committee might do to ensure that we're still promoting high standards in this space.
Right. Well, this is bipartisan. Darren LaHood and Susan Delbene, great examples of expressed concern among colleagues, and that's just two of many who are really diligently working on the digital front. The fact that the administration stepped away, whether it was IPEF or I think we're all nervous what might be said in the next ministerial with the WTO. We just don't sense a priority from the administration that, hey, here we are on the digital front, that we don't want to give that away. And, in our national interest, but consumer interests around the world. And realizing that on the digital front, it's not even, an entity replacing in the economy something else, but it is, the multiplier effect can be actually a little bit daunting at times, but what a great opportunity, again, I would say, for the administration to step up and say, here's what we need. Perhaps because of Congress and the bipartisan concerns in the legislative branch. But I'm very concerned that the administration, even with IPEF having no enforcement to it, that they backed off of anything digital along that route.
Hi, thank you for the time. I was wondering what the status is in regards to the critical minerals agreement between the U.S. and the EU, and what role Congress and the Ways and Means Committee is playing there, and what we expect in the next few months or.
Well, I don't think it's clear, it's certainly not clear enough yet for us to really be able to formulate a way forward. Now, critical minerals, the broader issue is getting a lot of conversation among colleagues, perhaps with the environmental point of view from some, economically speaking, and my own district has a play for critical minerals. I think that's a great opportunity for us in Middle America, but also, I think there's lacking clarity moving forward in terms of manufacturing, whether it's EVs totally or the hybrid approach. That's more on the manufacturing side, but the intensity of need for critical minerals, I think, will be there, but working out those details remains. But I think, again, it's a great example that we need to have the conversations moving forward that are not yet being had, at least that we've been informed of. So whether it's Europe, whether it's elsewhere, we need to engage.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I wanted to come back to de minimis. You were talking about what if we change de minimis and it's not, and enforcement doesn't change. What does that mean? So I wanted to ask you, of course, CBP is the one that has to enforce. What are they telling you, or their staff telling you, about what could be administrable? Like, are some of these ideas of like cutting out textiles or cutting out China specifically, are they saying, we don't think that would be effective and this is what we think would be more effective?
Yeah, I think overall there's concern about resources and how impactful, what they actually need moving forward. Now, I couldn't give you the exact specifics of what they actually want, but we want them to be able to do their job, and they've got a task. It's not easy with mere volume, and so that agility moving forward, I think, is important, so that they feel that they've got the opportunity and the ability to enforce without perhaps some distractions or some rigidity that they may not ultimately be as effective at accomplishing the objective as well.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your time. I think you insist very rightly on the importance of enforcement for the value of a trade agreement. But in the WTO, actually, it's the US administrations who killed the enforcement mechanism, although...
Sorry, the US, say again?
Who killed the enforcement mechanism, the dispute settlement process, although the country, quote unquote, won 85% of the panels they asked for. So I would like your thoughts about that.
The thoughts about the enforcement generally?
The fact that the US essentially got rid of the enforcement mechanism in the WTO.
Well, there's concern about WTO and the overall framework of how they operate, that basically one country can effectively have veto power over anything. So my colleagues, I hear from my colleagues a lot in terms of how the WTO is funded and how they operate, but heading into various big decisions, I grow concerned that the way it's structured, that other countries might have that veto authority. Well, are we utilizing our role the way we can and should as well? And TRIPS and so forth has given me concern that we're not even as ambiguous as some of these challenges are, that when we have the opportunity, because of the way they're structured, that we're not even taking advantage of those opportunities. That concerns me, and especially concerns my colleagues as well, who raise various concerns, and part of those were raised in the hearing last week as well.
We're just going to take one more question over there, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm Khushbu from the South China Morning Post. My question is about, we were talking about China and trade, and then we have this technology competition going on. I just wanted to get your thought on, right now the Biden administration is looking for areas to cooperate with China. Do you think agriculture is one area that can actually become the foundation of kind of rebuilding the relationship? Or is there a national security concern in that area as well? Because recently we had a senator saying that importing garlic is a national security concern. So I just wanted to get your thought on that. Thank you.
Well, there will be a number of different characterizations, with various interests in mind. I think by default, the fact that our ag sector is so productive and efficient, and the fact that everyone needs to eat around the world, and that 96% of the world's population lives outside our country, it's a natural fit that we are viewed as a leader in how important agriculture is to, like I said, feeding the world. So, over time, there's the numbers point to the fact we've given other countries more access to our markets than they've given us to theirs. That's a problem, and that just doesn't get swept aside when there aren't the engagements and the conversations that need to take place. So agriculture is front and center, make no mistake. And that's why other countries retaliate on agriculture, because they know how important it is to our country. And I will say that's even better reason that President Biden should address the Mexico corn issue just head on. And it can be done in a very diplomatic fashion. And so, 435 members of the House, another 100 senators, all free agents, so to speak, as it relates to representing their constituency and the various perspectives that they share. But that's the beauty of our system too, is it's broad-based. And let's utilize that in those various conversations. But that's what makes trade more difficult. That doesn't mean we should just walk away from doing what we need to do to really lean in. And like I said, it's an incredible opportunity to have the resources to help feed the world, without even mentioning the benefits of what a fed world can deliver. And that might be for several more conferences moving forward. But appreciate the opportunity. Glad you're here. Glad you're engaged and leaning into such important issues. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you one last question, because we're going to give everybody a little bit of homework, because this is the trade policy, a microcosm of the trade policy ecosystem here in DC. We talk about trade being stuck, but we are the policymakers, lobbyists, embassies. What would you like all of us to do to help get to a more constructive place on trade?
Sure. Well, trade as an issue might be stuck right now, but it won't stay stuck all by itself. I mean, the consumers, domestically and beyond, they are going to have some things to say about various things, and whether it's what they have to pay at the grocery store or elsewhere. But to really share the information, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, though, about, where were we X amount of time ago compared to where we are now, and where we can go moving forward. And, like I said, it's a complex issue, and it over time it has evolved a little bit that, can tilt the field against us domestically, but I also see that as an opportunity to elevate the discussion. I will tell you that even in a district like mine, before USMCA, say early Trump term, that trade was getting a bad name. Now I would say it was inaccurately that way, but the Trump administration, leaning into the trade issue writ large, elevated the discussions in coffee shops across my district, and I think across America. And whether it was Democrats opposed to tariffs at the time because they were Trump's tariffs or what have you, but the discussion was elevated in terms of what's happening, where have we been, where are we going with this? I think that's healthy, and we should utilize that moving forward to channel the discussion and be productive about it, and ultimately getting trade unstuck, but also in a productive fashion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Very grateful to you. Thank you, Stephanie. That is it, everybody. We are wrapping this up. Big thanks again to our sponsors, Amazon, the National Pork Producers Council, Trade Data Monitor, UPS, Business Roundtable, American Apparel and Footwear Association, the Aluminum Association, the Express Association of America, the National Retail Federation, and Trade Center Management Associates, our hosts in this lovely venue at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. Watch your inboxes. We're going to be announcing a pop-up briefing from Abu Dhabi and MC13 in a couple weeks. So I guess it's not really a pop-up briefing. It's sort of a pre-planned pop-up briefing. And on March 5th, we'll be back here at the Reagan Building for our Congressional Trade Councils event. That'll be March 5th. We hope to see you all in person, but we will also be available online for that as well. Thank you all for joining us. Everyone, take care. The sun is back out in D.C. Thank you for being here, and be safe.